Hey everyone, you're watching Mr.Spoocast. Tonight's video is going to be different. No myths, no jokes, just the kind of stories that feel too real after you've heard them. In this episode, I'll be telling 3 chilling first-hand accounts, 3 true-to-life experiences that will make your blood run cold. Turn the lights down, put your headphones on, and let's begin. Story 1. My wife came back from a fortune teller. And every night at 3:17, she wasn't herself. Introduction. I have tried to write this down 3 different times, each attempt ending with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hit the right keys. The problem isn't that I don't remember what happened. It's that I remember it too well, in the way you remember a smell that shouldn't exist in your own home, or the sound of your own front door opening when you know you locked it. I am not the kind of person who chases mysteries. I don't collect ghost stories. I don't go looking for meanings in coincidences. I work in logistics for a mid-sized distributor outside Rome, the kind of job where your day is measured in delivery windows, damaged pallets, and invoices that never match. My life has always been practical. If something breaks, you fix it. If you can't fix it, you replace it. If you can't replace it, you learn to live with it and stop thinking about it. That's why, for a long time, I tried to treat what happened to my wife the same way. A problem, then a solution. Stress, then rest. Sleepwalking, then a doctor. Anxiety, then therapy. I cycled through explanations the way you cycle through settings on a faulty machine, convinced that eventually one of them would fit and the noise would stop. But there are things that don't behave like machines. If you're watching this because you like stories that end neatly, with a culprit and a lesson, you should stop now. I don't have a tidy answer. What I have is a timeline I kept, because it was the only way I could convince myself I wasn't exaggerating. Notes on my phone, dates scribbled on the back of shipping manifests, voice recordings I made in the car because speaking the details out loud in the apartment felt dangerous. The details are ordinary, almost boring, which is what makes them hard to explain. And then, every night, something my wife did that didn't belong in our life. Her name is Elena. We've been together long enough that I can tell what mood she's in just by the way she drops her keys on the entry table. There's a careless clatter when she's tired, a careful placing when she's irritated, a soft toss when she's happy and wants to pretend she isn't. That's the level of familiarity I'm talking about. The kind that makes you stop noticing the person because they have become the default setting of your world. When this started, I didn't have the language for it. I kept telling myself she was off, that she was going through something, that I was being paranoid. Those were the phrases that let me go to work and act normal, that let me eat dinner across from her and talk about the price of groceries as if my body wasn't constantly braced for something. I am writing this now because the last thing that happened, what I think of as the last thing, though I don't know if it's truly over, left me with a simple, humiliating certainty. If I don't tell someone, it will collapse into my head and become mine alone. And if it stays mine alone, I will start doubting myself again. I will start rewriting the nights to make them less ugly, less impossible. I can already feel my mind trying to do it, smoothing the edges, changing the sequence, turning a pattern into a dream. So I am putting it in order. It began with a fortune teller. I know how that sounds. Even writing the words makes me want to add a disclaimer, to roll my eyes at myself, to reassure you that I'm educated and skeptical and not easily fooled. But that's exactly why it matters. Elena wasn't the kind of person who went to fortune tellers either. She wasn't superstitious. She didn't read horoscopes. When friends forwarded those viral "which month are you" posts, she ignored them. She had grown up with a Catholic grandmother who lit candles for saints and muttered prayers under her breath. But Elena's adulthood was built on the stubborn belief that the world is what you can touch, measure, schedule. That stubbornness did not vanish. It simply redirected. It happened in late autumn, when the air in the city turns thin and the light slants sideways even at noon. That season in Rome always makes people restless. You can feel it in the way strangers walk faster, shoulders slightly raised, as if they're trying to outrun the early dark. Elena had been restless for months, but in a way that seemed reasonable. Her mother had been in and out of the hospital with complications from diabetes. Elena's job at a small design studio had started hemorrhaging clients. We had begun to talk in careful, practical terms about savings, about what we could cut, about whether we should postpone the trip we kept promising ourselves. None of that is paranormal. None of it is even unusual. It's life. It's the normal grind that wears grooves into people. The fortune teller was not part of our plan. It was not a decision we discussed. It was, in Elena's telling, something that just happened. On a Wednesday evening, she came home later than usual. I heard the elevator, then the keys, then her steps in the corridor outside our door. I remember I was standing at the sink rinsing rice, the water running too hot. When she entered, her face had that look people get after spending time in a small room with no windows, slightly pale, eyes too bright, as if the air outside had shocked her. She didn't kiss me right away. She stood by the entry table, fingers still wrapped around her keys, and looked at me as if she had to confirm I was real. "Everything okay?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Yes. Just long day." Her coat smelled faintly of incense, the cheap kind sold in tourist shops, sweet and cloying. It was wrong on her. Elena usually smelled like her shampoo in the cold air outside. I noticed, and I should have asked then. I should have made her tell me where she'd been and why. But I was tired, and she was tired, and there are certain conversations couples postpone because they want one evening without another problem to solve. At dinner, she ate slowly, barely speaking, cutting her food into small pieces and then leaving them on the plate. She kept touching the inside of her left wrist with the pad of her thumb, a repetitive, absent motion, like checking for a pulse. Finally, when I asked again, more firmly, she said, "I went to see someone." "Someone from work?" "No." She hesitated, and in the hesitation, I felt the first tiny shift in the air between us. "I've been reader." I stared at her. "A reader? You know?" She waved her hand, impatient with her own words. "Cards, palm, that kind of thing." For a moment, I genuinely thought she was joking. Elena didn't joke much, but sometimes she made dry, unexpected comments that caught me off guard. I waited for her mouth to twist into a smile. It didn't. I felt the skin at the back of my neck tighten. "Why?" She looked down at her plate. It was near the studio. Marta and Kiara were going. They said it was just for fun. "And you went?" She nodded again, still too quickly. "Yes." "Did she ask for money?" Elena's mouth tightened. "Of course. How much?" she told me. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make me frown. We weren't desperate, but we had started counting. "What did she say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Elena swallowed. I watched the movement in her throat, the way her collarbone rose slightly with her breath. She said I have something attached to me." I let out a short, involuntary laugh. It came out harsher than I intended. "Attached?" Elena's eyes flicked up sharp. "Don't. I'm sorry," I said immediately. "It's just, Elena, come on." "I know how it sounds," she said. But she described things, specific things, about my mother, about the apartment, about you. That got my attention. I leaned forward. "What things?" Elena pressed her lips together, as if she regretted bringing it up. She said there's a presence in our building, that it isn't in the walls, it's in the routines. She said it finds people when they're exhausted, when they repeat the same paths every day. She said it rides along like static. I stared at her, feeling my skepticism fighting with something else. Irritation, maybe, or fear of being forced into a conversation that had no solution. "Elena," I said. "She could have said that to anyone. It's vague." "It didn't feel vague," she replied. "She told me the exact time my mother calls me every night. She told me what floor we live on without me saying it. She told me you leave the house at 6:42. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Those details weren't impossible to guess, but they were uncomfortable. "Maybe she watched you," I said. "Maybe she's done this to other people in the neighborhood." Elena's gaze stayed on me, unwavering. She said it will start with small things at night. She said I'll feel compelled to do things I don't understand, and if I ignore it, it will get louder. There was silence. The refrigerator clicked on. The sound felt too big in the small kitchen. "Okay," I said finally, forcing calm. "So what did she recommend? Some charm? A cleansing? A candle?" Elena's fingers tightened around her fork. She said I have to listen, that I have to let it show me what it wants. She said if I fight it, it will hurt the people closest to me. My stomach dropped in a slow, heavy way. "That's manipulation," I said, anger flaring now because it was easier than fear. "That's a threat. She's trying to scare you so you'll come back and pay her more." Elena's face hardened. "You didn't hear her." "No," I said, "I didn't. But I've heard people like that before." Elena pushed her plate away, appetite gone. "It's not like that." I wanted to argue more. I wanted to demand the address, the name, to march down there and confront the woman, to do something that would restore the shape of our world. But Elena's shoulders were hunched, her eyes glassy with fatigue, and the thought of turning the evening into a fight felt cruel. So I did what I often do when something unsettles me and I can't fix it immediately. I tried to minimize it. "Okay," I said softly. "It was a weird experience. It got into your head. That's all. Tomorrow you'll feel better." Elena didn't respond. She stood, rinsed her plate, and went to the bathroom. I heard the tap run. I heard the cabinet open and close. Then the light in the hallway went off, and she disappeared into the bedroom. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, staring at the wet grains of rice in the sink strainer, listening to the building settle. The pipes in our walls always made small, irregular clicks as the water cooled. I had lived there long enough to tune it out. That night, for the first time, I didn't tune it out. When I finally went to bed, Elena was lying on her side, facing away from me. Her breathing was steady, but her hand was tucked under her pillow as if she was gripping something. The room smelled faintly of that incense, lingering in her hair. I lay down carefully, trying not to disturb her, and stared at the dark ceiling. At some point I drifted off, and at some point later I woke up because the mattress shifted. I didn't open my eyes right away. In the half-sleep state, you interpret movement as normal, your partner turning over, adjusting the blanket. But the movement continued. Elena was sitting up. I could feel it in the way the bed dipped. Then I heard something else, a sound so quiet I almost dismissed it as my own breathing. Fingernails lightly scraping fabric. Elena was doing something with her hands. Repetitive. Deliberate. I opened my eyes. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 3:17. The room was dark enough that shapes were vague, but I could see Elena's outline, upright, head slightly bowed. Her shoulders moved in small motions. Her hands were at her wrist. For a second I thought she was checking the time too, or scratching an itch. Then she turned her head a fraction, and the light from the clock caught one eye. It was open. Not sleepy open. Not blinking. Just open, fixed on something in the dark that I couldn't see. My throat tightened. "Elena?" I whispered. She didn't respond. I reached out, touched her arm. Her skin was cold. Not cool from the room. Cold like she had been standing outside. "Elena," I said again, louder. Her head turned slowly toward me. The movement was not smooth. It was like something pulling on a string. Her gaze landed on my face and held there. Her pupil looked too large in the dim light. Her lips parted slightly as if she was about to speak. Instead, she lifted her left hand and, with her fingernail, pressed a line into the skin of her wrist. Not hard enough to bleed. Hard enough to leave a white mark that slowly turned pink. She did it again. And again. Parallel lines. Careful. Measured? A sensation crawled over my arms. The kind you get when you realize someone is watching you from behind. "Elena, stop," I said and grabbed her wrist gently. The moment my fingers closed around her, her whole body tensed. For a heartbeat she resisted, not in anger but in reflex, like an animal startled. Her eyes widened. Then she blinked, once, rapidly, and the tension drained out of her shoulders as if someone had released pressure. "What are you doing?" I asked. She stared at my hand on her wrist, confused. "What?" You were scratching yourself." She pulled her hand back, rubbed her wrist as if it hurt. I was asleep. "No, you were sitting up." Elena looked around the room, disoriented. I don't remember." Her voice was hoarse. She cleared her throat. "Did I wake you?" I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to tell her exactly what I'd seen, but the words felt too dramatic, too charged. I pictured her face tightening, her stubbornness hardening into defensiveness. I pictured a fight at 3 a.m. So again, I minimized. "You were probably dreaming," I said. "You scratched yourself." "It's fine." Elena lay back down, turning away. Within minutes, her breathing steadied again. I lay there, eyes open, listening to the pipes click and the elevator hum somewhere above, and told myself it was nothing. A stress reaction, a weird sleep habit. But my eyes kept drifting to her wrist, where faint parallel marks were already darkening. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a phrase Elena had repeated from the fortune teller kept turning over like a loose object in a dryer. Small things at night. Elena and I had lived in that apartment for 4 years. Not long enough to call it forever, but long enough that the place had absorbed our habits. The corner of the sofa where she folded her legs under herself. The shallow dent in the mattress on my side. The small scratch on the kitchen door where I'd carried in a wardrobe and misjudged the angle. Ordinary marks that made the rooms feel like ours. We were on the 6th floor of a pale, aging building tucked between a busier avenue and a quieter residential street. It wasn't historic in the postcard way. No ivy, no dramatic arches, just stucco that had been repainted too many times, and a stairwell that always smelled faintly of disinfectant and old mail. The elevator was narrow and impatient, with a mirror scratched by keys and the same advertisement for a locksmith that had been taped inside since we moved in. Our neighbors were the kind you recognize more by sound than by face. A couple above us, who argued in short bursts and then went silent for days. An older man across the hall whose television played football commentary at volumes that made the walls vibrate. A family with 2 children who lived on the 2nd floor. You could always tell when the children were sick, because their mother carried them up the stairs instead of letting them run. If someone had asked me before all of this whether the building felt safe, I would have said yes without thinking. Not because it had guards or cameras, but because nothing happened there. The most excitement we'd ever had was a package thief in the lobby the previous winter. People complained in the residents' group chat for a week, then it dissolved into arguments about recycling bins. Inside our apartment, everything was practical. We didn't decorate to impress anyone. We had the kind of furniture you buy when you're not sure how long you'll stay. A plain dining table with mismatched chairs because one had broken and we hadn't replaced it yet. Curtains that were too short because Elena insisted it didn't matter. A small balcony with 2 metal chairs that were always slightly cold to the touch, even in summer. Our routines were boring, which is another way of saying they were stable. I woke early for work. Elena stayed up later. She liked to do laundry at night because she said the building was quieter and the machine didn't annoy anyone. She drank chamomile tea like it was medicine, slowly, staring out of the kitchen window at the courtyard lights. I drank coffee too fast and then spent the first half of my commute trying to ignore the burn in my stomach. When Elena's mother started getting worse, our routines tightened. Not in a dramatic way. No melodramatic scenes, no shouting in the street, just a quiet narrowing. Elena began checking her phone more often. She set her mother's doctor's number as a favorite contact. She kept a notebook in her bag with medication names and appointment dates and questions written in small, careful handwriting. Every night at 21:10, her mother called. Not because it was the only time she could, but because that's when she had always called, long before the hospital visits. Elena would answer, move to the far end of the living room near the window, and speak in a voice that was softer and higher than the one she used with me. I could usually hear the cadence without catching the words. Sometimes Elena would laugh in that strained way people laugh when they're trying to prove they aren't scared. Sometimes she would go quiet and listen, eyes unfocused as if counting breaths. After the call, she often stood in the doorway of the balcony for a minute, inhaling cold air as if she needed it to stay upright. Then she would come back in, close the glass door carefully, and act normal. Make dinner, ask me about my day, complain about a client, put on a show we'd both half-watch. It's important to explain this because when people hear my wife started doing strange things, they want a reason. They want the neat explanation of a mind under pressure. And I can't honestly say Elena was fine before the fortune teller. She was exhausted. Anyone would have been. She carried her worry in her body, tight shoulders, shallow breaths, headaches that came suddenly and left her pale. She didn't cry much, but she went through phases of being unusually careful with everything, as if neatness could hold the world together. I tried to help in the ways I know how. I did the grocery shopping. I drove her to the hospital on weekends. I sat in waiting rooms, scrolling through my phone and pretending I wasn't watching the way her hands trembled when the doctor spoke. I offered solutions when she wanted comfort, and comfort when she wanted solutions. Sometimes I got it wrong. Sometimes I got it wrong in a way that made her go quiet for an entire evening. We were not at our best, but we were still us. That's why the visit to the fortune teller felt like a foreign object suddenly dropped into our life. It didn't match anything else. It wasn't a gradual shift. It was a decision that seemed to have been made somewhere outside our shared world and then carried home like a smell. The day after Elena went, she acted as if she regretted telling me. At breakfast, she moved around the kitchen with clipped efficiency, avoiding my eyes. The marks on her wrist were faint but visible, thin reddish lines that looked like she'd been dragged through thorny branches. When she noticed me looking, she pulled her sleeve down and said too quickly, "It's nothing." "Does it hurt?" I asked. "No." She poured more coffee into her mug, even though it was already full. "I must have scratched myself." "In your sleep?" She shrugged. The shrug was sharp, defensive. "Maybe." I didn't push. I told myself, don't turn this into a bigger thing. Don't give it weight. If you act like it's strange, it will become strange. All day at work, though, I kept seeing the image of her sitting upright in the dark, drawing lines into her skin with the patience of someone marking a page. I caught myself checking the time without thinking, as if 3:17 was now an appointment I might miss. I caught myself listening for my phone when it buzzed, expecting a message from her, some admission or question. There was nothing. When I came home that evening, the apartment looked exactly the same. The familiar clutter of our life was intact. Elena's shoes under the bench, the kitchen sponge on the edge of the sink, a half-finished sketch on the table, covered by a sheet of paper to keep it from smudging. Everything ordinary, everything in its place. But Elena was not. She greeted me normally, kissed my cheek, asked if I wanted pasta or soup. Her voice sounded like her voice. Her eyes looked like her eyes. If I hadn't seen her the night before, I might have been able to believe it had been nothing. And yet there were small adjustments in her behavior, the kind you notice only because you know someone's baseline so well. She moved more quietly than usual. She closed doors without letting them click. When she walked from one room to another, her steps were careful, as if she was trying not to disturb the air. At one point, while I was washing dishes, I heard her in the bedroom opening and closing drawers, not rummaging but searching with purpose. When I asked what she was doing, she said, "Just organizing," and her tone made it clear she didn't want a follow-up. That night we went to bed earlier than usual because Elena said she was tired. She turned off the light herself, which she almost never did. She preferred the lamp on the nightstand, a soft glow, so it doesn't feel like falling into a hole, as she once put it. In the dark, I listened to her breathing and wondered if she was asleep. I wondered if she was pretending. I fell asleep anyway. I always do. My body collapses when it gets the chance, no matter what my mind is doing. Over the next week, life kept happening in its dull, relentless way. Elena visited her mother. I dealt with a delayed shipment that turned into a mess of phone calls. We argued once about money, not loudly, but with the brittle tension that comes from two tired people trying to sound reasonable. And threaded through those ordinary days was Elena's new habit of touching her wrist. Always the left one. Thumb pressed to the inside, then a slow rub, as if she was trying to erase something. The skin there stayed slightly irritated even when the lines faded. I began noticing the building more, too. Not because it changed, but because my attention changed. I paid attention to the way the hallway lights flickered sometimes. Not enough to go out, but enough to make the corridor feel like it was breathing. I listened to the elevator cables, the faint metallic whine when someone rode up late at night. I noticed a smell that drifted occasionally through the stairwell, sweet smoke, like incense, though I told myself it was just someone burning something in their apartment or in the courtyard. One evening, as we were bringing groceries up from the car, the older man across the hall held the door for us. He nodded at Elena, then at me, and said, "You're up late these days." I paused. "We just got back from the store." He shook his head slowly, as if choosing not to argue. "No. I mean, never mind." He let the door swing shut behind him with a gentle click that felt deliberate. Elena didn't react. She carried the grocery bag inside and set it on the counter, calm, methodical. But I stood in the kitchen with my keys in my hand and felt something move under my skin, an irrational, prickling sense that the building had been watching us and had finally decided to comment. That night before bed, Elena washed her hands for a long time. Not frantic, not panicked. Just longer than normal, as if she needed to be sure. Water ran over her fingers until the skin looked pale and tight. When she turned off the tap, she held her wet hands over the sink and stared at them, motionless, until a drop slid off her thumb and hit the metal with a soft tick. "Elena," I said, keeping my voice low, "do you want to talk about that woman you saw?" She didn't look at me. "There's nothing to talk about. You keep rubbing your wrist." She finally turned her head. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else there, too. Something guarded. "It's just a habit." "Since when?" She exhaled through her nose. "Since now." I wanted to say the obvious, that habits don't appear out of nowhere, that people don't sit up at 3:17 and carve lines into themselves and then call it nothing. But the way she looked at me made my words stall in my throat. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet warning, like a door being closed gently. So I nodded. I said, "Okay," and we went to bed. In the dark, I lay awake longer than usual, listening. The building was never truly silent. There was always water moving somewhere, always a distant footstep or a muffled television. But that night, I was aware of the sounds with a sharpness that made them feel separate, like each one had been placed intentionally. At 2348, the elevator rose past our floor and continued upward. At 012, someone's faucet turned on for exactly the length of time it takes to fill a glass. At 103, the couple upstairs shifted furniture, the scrape long and slow. At 129, the older man's television clicked off. At 210, a door in the hallway opened and closed very softly. And at 3:17, even before the mattress moved, even before I heard Elena's breathing change, my eyes opened as if someone had called my name. I lay still, staring into the dark, waiting for the familiar dip of her weight leaving the bed. Waiting for the first small thing, first irregularities. The second time it happened, I didn't touch her. That's the difference between the first night and the ones that followed. The first time, instinct took over. I saw something I didn't understand and tried to stop it with my hands, with my voice, with proximity. The second time, some deeper part of me, quieter, colder, decided to watch instead. I woke again before the movement. There was no nightmare, no jolt of fear, just a clean, abrupt awareness, like a switch being flipped. The room was exactly as it had been when I fell asleep. Curtains unmoving. The faint orange glow from the street lamp leaking through the gap at the edge. The clock on my nightstand read 3:16. I remember thinking very clearly that it was almost funny. My mind actually tried to laugh at itself. Look at you, I thought, anticipating things now, making patterns out of numbers. Then Elena inhaled sharply. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a gasp. It was the kind of breath you take when you're about to stand up after sitting too long. Preparatory. Purposeful. The mattress shifted. Slowly this time. No sudden jerk. No fumbling. She sat up. I stayed still. I didn't even turn my head. I watched her reflection in the dark glass of the wardrobe across the room, a faint, distorted outline. Her back was straight. Her shoulders relaxed. There was no sign of distress. If someone had walked in at that moment, they would have thought she was simply awake, thinking. Her hands moved. Not to her wrist right away. First, she placed them flat on her thighs, fingers splayed, palms down. She pressed them there firmly as if grounding herself. Then she lifted her left hand and brought it slowly toward her face. She sniffed her wrist. Once. Twice. Then she lowered her hand and began tracing over the same spot as before, following the faintly darker lines in her skin. This time she used the pad of her finger, not her nail. The motion was almost tender. Careful, like checking the stitching on a wound. I felt a pressure build behind my eyes. My body wanted to react, to interrupt, but something else held me back. A sense, not fully conscious, that if I broke the sequence, something worse might happen. That whatever this was, it was operating by rules I didn't understand, and barging in blindly would only escalate it. The clock ticked over to 3:17. Elena tilted her head slightly as if listening. There was nothing to hear. The building was in one of its quieter phases. No elevator. No water. Just the low hum of distant traffic and the faint electrical buzz of the clock. Her lips moved. At first I thought she was whispering. I strained to hear words, syllables, anything, but there was no sound. Her mouth was shaping something silently, carefully, repeating it. Over and over, my skin prickled. The sense of being watched returned, stronger now, as if the room itself was leaning in. Elena's hand dropped to her side. For a moment, she did nothing. She simply sat there, mouth still moving, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the foot of the bed. Then she stood up. The mattress rose as her weight left it. She didn't sway. She didn't hesitate. She stood as if she had been awake for hours. My heart began to pound hard enough that I was sure she could hear it. She took one step toward the bedroom door. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. Every part of me screamed that this was the line. Sitting up was one thing. Standing was another. Movement meant intent. "Elena," I said quietly. She stopped. For a split second, relief flooded me. "See?" I thought. She hears me. She's responsive. This is still her. She turned her head. Her eyes met mine in the dark. Not unfocused. Not glazed. Sharp. Aware. And empty. There was no recognition there. No confusion. No irritation. Just a flat, assessing look, like someone glancing at a piece of furniture they had forgotten was in the room. My voice faltered. "Are you okay?" She held my gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then slowly she shook her head. Once, not no exactly. More like, not relevant. She turned back toward the door and opened it. The hinge made a faint sound. A tiny squeal I'd never noticed before, magnified by the silence. Elena paused again, as if acknowledging it. Then she stepped into the hallway. I lay there, frozen, staring at the open doorway. The darkness beyond looked thicker somehow, as if the air itself was heavier outside the bedroom. I told myself, follow her. This is your wife. Don't lie here like a coward. But my body didn't move. I listened instead. Her footsteps were soft. Bare feet on tile. Slow. Evenly spaced. Not wandering. Directed. She went toward the living room. Then the balcony door. I heard the faint click of the latch. Cold air slid into the bedroom, brushing my face. With it came that same sweet, cloying smell. Incense. My stomach turned. I forced myself up. The sheets tangled around my legs as I swung them over the side of the bed. The floor was cold, grounding. Real. I stood there for a second, steadying myself, then moved toward the door. The hallway light was off, but the living room was faintly illuminated by the streetlights outside. Enough to see shapes. Enough to see Elena standing by the open balcony door, her silhouette outlined against the night. She wasn't leaning over the railing. She was standing perfectly straight, feet together, arms at her sides. Her head was tilted back. She was looking up. I followed her gaze instinctively, heart in my throat. Above us were 2 more floors, then the roof. The sky beyond was a dull, washed-out gray, the color it gets in cities where light pollution never lets it go fully dark. There was nothing there. No movement. No figure. No shadow crossing the stars. Elena raised her left hand. Slowly, deliberately, she extended it upward, palm open, fingers slightly curled, as if waiting for something to be placed there. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. "Elena," I said again, louder now. "Please." She didn't react. Her fingers twitched. Then, very gently, they closed. As if around an invisible thread, she tugged. Just once. A sharp, involuntary sound escaped my throat. I didn't even recognize it as my own voice. It was the noise you make when you see someone misstep on a staircase and you can't stop it in time. "Elena!" I rushed forward and grabbed her arm. This time the reaction was violent. She jerked away from me with surprising strength, her arm twisting in my grip. Her other hand flew up and struck my wrist, hard, knocking my hand aside. Pain flared, sudden and bright. She spun to face me, eyes wide now, blazing with something that looked like anger, but felt colder. "Don't," she said. It was the first word she'd spoken. Her voice was low, strained, unfamiliar. Not loud. Controlled. I froze. "You're interrupting," she continued. Interrupting. The word echoed in my head, absurd and terrifying. Interrupting what? I demanded. Her gaze flicked past me, back up toward the sky, toward the invisible point she'd been focused on. Her jaw clenched. "I almost had it," she said. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Had what?" She looked at me again, really looked this time, and something shifted in her expression. A crack. Confusion seeped in around the edges like ink spreading in water. Her voice wavered. She blinked rapidly. "Why am I out here?" "You were sleepwalking," I said quickly, seizing the opening. "You were doing something strange. You scared me." Elena looked down at her hands. They were trembling now, small, rapid shakes. She pressed them together, then rubbed her wrist hard, as if trying to warm it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't remember." I closed the balcony door, locked it, pulled the curtain shut with more force than necessary. The room felt suddenly exposed, like we'd left something important open for too long. I guided her back to the bedroom. She let me. She seemed drained, compliant, her earlier tension gone. When we lay down, she curled into herself, knees drawn up, breathing shallow and fast. "I don't know why I said that," she murmured. "About interrupting. I don't know why I went out there. I wanted to ask 100 questions. About the invisible thread. About what she almost had. About whether she remembered the fortune teller's words. But her body was already sinking into sleep, exhaustion reclaiming her. I lay awake until dawn, my wrist throbbing where she'd struck it, staring at the ceiling as pale light crept into the room. In the morning, she remembered none of it. Not the balcony, not the words, not the anger in her eyes. Only the soreness in her arm and the deeper, darker marks on her wrist, where her fingers had dug in as if she'd been holding on to something that fought to be free. Further escalating tension. After the balcony night, I stopped pretending this was a phase. That's the lie people tell themselves when reality begins to tilt. Phase, episode, rough patch. Words that imply an arc, a beginning, and an end. I stopped using them because nothing about what was happening suggested an ending. It suggested a process. Elena insisted she felt fine. That was the most unsettling part. In daylight, she was functional, articulate, even affectionate. She went to work. She visited her mother. She complained about the same thing she always had. If I brought up the night, even carefully, even framed as concern, she listened with a furrowed brow and genuine confusion. "I would remember that," she kept saying. "I've never sleepwalked in my life." She began to look at me differently after a few days. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the polite distance you use when someone is worrying you in a way you don't understand. When I asked if she'd been dreaming, she said no. When I asked if she felt urges at night, she said she slept deeply and without interruption. And yet, every night, at exactly the same time, my body woke before my mind could object. 13:15, 13 minut, 16 секунд, 13:17. I stopped checking the clock after the third night. I didn't need to. My internal sense of time had calibrated itself to the pattern with humiliating precision. Sometimes Elena sat up. Sometimes she didn't. That was worse. On the nights she didn't move, I lay beside her listening to changes so subtle they barely qualified as sounds. The shift in her breathing, the faint tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers flexed against the sheet in slow, deliberate rhythms. Her body reacted even when it stayed still, as if something inside her was rehearsing. I stopped sleeping properly. I dozed in shallow fragments, always aware of the bed, the room, the space around us. I began to dread the quiet hours, the stretch of night where nothing should be happening. The building started to feel different too, Not hostile, not overtly threatening, but attentive. I began noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. The elevator almost always stopped on our floor after midnight, even when no one I knew was coming or going. The hallway light outside our door flickered more frequently, sometimes going dark for a second at a time before returning, as if testing the switch. Once, when I stepped into the stairwell to take out the trash late at night, I found a thin line scratched into the concrete wall near the 6th floor landing. It ran horizontally, about wrist height, shallow but intentional. When I touched it, chalky dust clung to my fingertip. I told myself it had always been there. I started keeping my phone on the nightstand with the camera app open, screen dimmed, volume off. I told myself it was for evidence, for clarity, for sanity. In truth, it was a talisman, something to hold between me and the unknown. The 4th night after the balcony incident, Elena didn't get out of bed. She spoke instead. Her lips barely moved, but this time there was sound. Not words. Cadence. A low, rhythmic murmur that rose and fell like breathing, but too deliberate to be unconscious. The sounds scraped at my nerves because they weren't random. They repeated. A sequence of tones that circled back on themselves, over and over, like someone practicing a phrase they weren't allowed to forget. I raised the phone slightly, my hand trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. The red recording dot glowed faintly. "Elena," I whispered. The murmuring stopped instantly. Too instantly. She turned her head toward me. Her eyes opened, and for a brief moment I saw something like irritation cross her face, as if I'd broken her concentration. Then it vanished. "What?" she asked, thick with sleep. "You were talking," I said. She frowned. "I was dreaming." "What were you saying?" "I don't know." She rolled onto her side, back toward me. "Please stop waking me up like this." The next morning, I listened to the recording in my car before work. There were no voices, just breathing. My breathing. And underneath it, something else so faint I could barely make it out. A low, irregular hum, not quite mechanical, not quite organic. It rose in volume at 317, then faded. I played it 3 times before shutting the phone off and sitting there with my hands on the steering wheel, heart racing, sweat dampening my collar despite the cold. That day, Elena forgot her scarf. It doesn't sound important. It shouldn't be, but Elena never forgot things. She was meticulous about her belongings, especially in winter. She hated the feeling of cold air on her neck. When I came home, the scarf was still draped over the back of the kitchen chair, exactly where she'd left it that morning. I picked it up. It smelled like incense. Not faintly. Strongly. The smell clung to the fabric in a way that made my stomach churn, sweet and suffocating. I pressed it to my face despite myself, inhaled, trying to identify it. It wasn't one of the common scents, no sandalwood, no vanilla. It was sharper, medicinal underneath the sweetness, like something burned not to please but to signal. When Elena got home, I asked her where she'd been at lunch. She told me. Cafe near the studio. Salad. Phone call with her mother. "Did you go anywhere else?" I asked. "No," she said, puzzled. "Why?" I held up the scarf. "This smells like incense." She took it from me, sniffed it, and frowned. "It smells like laundry detergent." I watched her face carefully as she said it, looking for hesitation, for calculation. There was none. That night, I locked the balcony door before bed and checked it twice. I closed the bedroom door too, something we never did. The click of the latch felt final, like a decision. Elena noticed but didn't comment. At 3:16, her hand slid across the sheet toward the edge of the bed. At 3:17, her fingers curled around nothing. She tugged. I grabbed her wrist before I could think better of it. She reacted instantly, eyes snapping open, body tensing. This time she didn't strike me. She simply stared at our joined hands, breathing hard. "It's heavier now," she said. My blood ran cold. "What is?" She swallowed. "I can't pull it through anymore." "The door is wrong." "What door?" My voice shook. She looked past me, toward the bedroom wall, eyes narrowing slightly. "You closed it." I released her wrist as if burned. She blinked. "What are we talking about?" she asked, genuinely confused. "Why are you holding my arm?" I didn't answer. because somewhere deep in my chest, a certainty had settled with terrifying calm. Whatever had attached itself to Elena wasn't just influencing her. It was responding to me. Critical incident. The week after she said, "The door is wrong," I started doing things that would have embarrassed me if anyone had seen. I began sleeping with my keys in the nightstand drawer. I put a chair under the balcony handle even though the lock was solid. I taped a strip of paper over the bedroom door latch so I could tell if it had been opened, the way people do in hotel rooms when they don't trust the cleaning staff. I told myself it was precaution, rational, temporary. But the truth was simpler. I was afraid of waking up and finding the apartment rearranged around me. Elena seemed lighter in the daytime, almost relieved, as if whatever strained her at night left her with a strange clarity during the day. She laughed more easily. She hummed while making coffee. She kissed my cheek when she passed behind my chair. It was the version of her I'd been missing, which should have comforted me. It didn't. It felt like the calm you get after a storm, when you know the air is still charged and the next strike could come without warning. 2 nights later, I tried an experiment I hated myself for. I waited until Elena was asleep, really asleep, breathing deep, mouth slightly open, and I moved the paper tape on the bedroom latch so it would tear if the door opened. Then I placed my phone face down on the dresser with the flashlight setting ready, and I lay back down fully clothed. I told myself, if she gets up, you will not touch her. You will not speak. You will observe. You will gather proof. You will keep calm. My body did not cooperate with my rules. At 3:13, my eyes opened. At 3:16, the air in the room felt different. Thicker, like someone had lowered the ceiling. At 3:17, Elena sat up. This time she didn't start at her wrist. She didn't sniff her skin. She didn't mouth silent syllables. She turned her head toward the bedroom door and stared at it. A long, motionless stare that made my chest tighten. Her posture was too straight, too alert. It reminded me of someone listening for a sound only they could hear. Then she stood. She moved to the door with quiet certainty, reached out, and placed her palm flat against the wood. Not the handle. The center panel, fingers spread as if feeling for warmth. She held it there. Her shoulders rose with a slow inhale. And then she pressed. Not hard enough to open it. There was no pressure on the latch, but hard enough that the door trembled faintly in its frame. She pressed again. The tape over the latch didn't tear. Elena's hand slid down the wood until her fingers found the handle. She gripped it. Her thumb rubbed the metal once, as if testing it. Then she turned it gently. The latch clicked. The tape tore with a tiny sound, almost like a whisper. Elena paused. Her head angled slightly to the side, as if acknowledging that noise, as if the apartment itself had spoken. Then she opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, but a faint light pulsed from somewhere, an intermittent glow, weak and rhythmic. The hallway light. Flicker. Off. Flicker. On. Elena stepped into the hall without hesitation. I lay still for 2 seconds, 3, trying to force myself to follow my own plan. Then fear overrode everything. I got up and followed. The floorboards didn't creak. I'd always thought they would, but at that hour, in that tension, the apartment seemed to swallow sound. I moved into the hallway, careful, and saw Elena walking toward the entryway. She didn't glance back. She didn't check the walls. She walked like she knew exactly where she was going. At the entryway, she reached for the chain lock. We never used the chain lock. It was flimsy, more symbolic than protective. Elena unhooked it with practiced ease, as if she'd done it 1,000 times. Then she unlocked the main lock. The door opened inward with the faint suction sound doors make in old buildings. Cold air rushed in, carrying a smell that punched the breath out of me. Incense. Strong, dense, layered with something sharper underneath, like scorched herbs, like medicine burned too long. Elena stepped out into the corridor. I froze in the doorway of our apartment, staring after her into the building's hallway. It was empty. No footsteps approaching, no neighbor's door opening, no shadow moving at the end of the hall. Just Elena, barefoot, wearing her thin cotton sleep shirt, walking toward the elevator. The hallway light flickered again, and for a split second her face looked wrong in the shifting brightness. Features flattened, eyes too dark, expression blank. "Elena," I whispered, my voice barely functioning. "Stop." She didn't stop. The elevator was at the 6th floor, doors closed. Elena pressed the call button. It lit up immediately, bright yellow in the dark. The elevator doors slid open with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, the dim bulb overhead cast a weak cone of light on the scratched mirror. The locksmith advertisement was still there, curled at the corners. Elena stepped in. I lurched forward, heart hammering, and put my hand on the doorframe before the doors could close. "Elena, what are you doing?" I asked, and my voice sounded too loud, too fragile in the enclosed space. Elena turned her head toward me. Her eyes were open, focused. There was still no recognition. But there was something else now, something I hadn't seen before. Impatience. The same look Elena gave when she was waiting for a slow cashier or a delayed bus. A look that said, "You are slowing me down." "Come," she said. One word. Flat. Commanding. I stared at her, and in that moment I realized I was standing on the threshold of a choice I didn't want. If I refused, she would go alone. If I followed, I would be stepping into whatever pattern had claimed her nights. My body made the decision before my mind could. I stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut behind me. The small enclosed space smelled like cold metal and old perfume and faintly incense seeping in from Elena's clothes. Elena reached out and pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator lurched and began to descend. The cables above us whined softly. The movement made my stomach float, the way elevators always do, but amplified by the fear that this was wrong, that we should not be moving through the building at this hour. Elena stared at the doors. Her left hand was at her side, fingers flexing. Open, curl, open, curl, like she was holding a rope that wasn't there. The elevator passed the 5th floor, then the 4th. Halfway down, Elena's lips moved. Not silently. Soundlessly, yes, but shaping something again with precision. I leaned closer, trying to hear. There was only the hum of the elevator, the faint rattle of the old mechanism. At the 2nd floor, the elevator jerked slightly, then continued. At the 1st floor, it slowed. The doors opened onto the lobby. The lobby was dim, lit by the weak overhead light near the mailboxes. The glass front doors reflected the street lamp glow outside. The air smelled of damp stone and stale dust. And something else. That incense smell was stronger here, as if it had been burned recently. Elena stepped out. I followed, my bare feet sticking slightly to the cold tile. My pulse felt like it was in my throat. The lobby was empty, but I noticed immediately that the front doors were not fully closed. They were shut but not latched. The slightest gap showed at the seam, enough to let in a thin thread of cold air. Elena walked straight to them. I moved faster, cutting between her and the door, blocking her path. "Elena, please," I said, and my voice cracked. "You can't go outside like this." She stopped, eyes on me, expression tightening. For a second, I saw something like confusion flicker across her face, as if my presence was unexpected. Then her gaze shifted past my shoulder, toward the door, and the impatience returned, colder now. "You're in the way," she said. The words hit me like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they were so wrong in her mouth. Elena never spoke to me like that, not even in arguments. "I'm not letting you go out," I said. "It's the middle of the night. You're not awake. You don't understand." Her hand rose, not toward me, toward my chest. She placed her palm lightly against my sternum. The touch was gentle, almost careful, and yet my body reacted as if she had pressed a bruise. A deep ache radiated outward, sudden and nauseating. I gasped and stumbled back instinctively. Elena didn't push. She didn't shove. She simply moved forward as I moved away, reclaiming the space, the way water fills a gap. She pulled the front door open. Cold night air flooded in. The street outside was quiet, lit by lamps that made the pavement look wet even when it wasn't. A few cars were parked along the curb. Farther down, a scooter stood tipped slightly on its stand. There were no people. Elena stepped outside barefoot onto the stone threshold. My heart lurched. "Elena!" She didn't flinch. She walked out onto the sidewalk. I followed, the cold biting through my socks as I stepped outside, the night air shocking my lungs. Elena moved with purpose down the street. Not toward the hospital. Not toward the studio. Not toward anywhere that made sense. She walked toward the small side street that ran behind our building, a narrower lane lined with parked cars and shuttered shops. At that hour, it felt abandoned, the kind of street that makes your footsteps sound too loud. The further we went, the stronger the smell became. Incense, yes, but also something metallic, like old coins, like blood that had dried somewhere you couldn't see. Elena turned left into the side street. A few meters in, she stopped. She looked at the wall of our building. There was a service door there, metal, painted the same beige as the stucco, with a simple handle and a lock. It led to the basement storage and utility rooms. We never used it. Residents were supposed to enter through the lobby only. The service door was usually closed and ignored. Elena stepped up to it. She placed her left hand on the handle. Her fingers curled. She tugged. The door did not open. Elena's jaw tightened. Her shoulders rose slightly. She tugged again, harder. Still nothing. For the first time, frustration sharpened her movements. She released the handle, flexed her fingers, then grabbed it again with both hands. She pulled. The metal rattled in its frame. "Elena," I said, standing behind her, afraid to touch her now. "Stop." "Please," she didn't respond. Her breathing had changed, faster now, shallow, controlled. Like exertion, she leaned her forehead against the door and spoke, softly into the metal. This time I heard the words, not Italian, not any language I recognized. The sounds were low and rounded, then sharp and clipped, repeated in a sequence that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like gibberish. It sounded structured, like a phrase with grammar. She repeated it 3 times, exactly the same each time, as if reciting something memorized. Then she paused. Her hands loosened on the handle. She listened. I held my breath, straining to hear what she might hear. At first, there was only the distant hum of the city, a far-off car, a faint bark of a dog. Then, from behind the door, something moved. A sound like fabric dragging across concrete. Very slow. Very close. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might vomit. "Elena," I whispered, barely able to form the sound. "There's someone in there." Elena lifted her head and smiled. It was small. Brief. Not Elena's smile. It didn't reach her eyes. She spoke again, a single phrase in that same unfamiliar cadence. The sound behind the door stopped. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the lock clicked. Not the sound of a key turning. The sound of something sliding. The door shifted inward slightly, opening a crack no wider than 2 fingers. A line of darkness appeared, thick and absolute. Air breathed out of it, cold, damp, carrying the concentrated smell of incense and something moldy and old. Elena's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. She began to pull it open. That was the moment my body finally acted without permission. I grabbed her from behind, wrapping my arms around her waist and hauling her back. She let out a sound, not a scream, not a cry, but a guttural exhale of rage, as if I had wrenched something away from her. She twisted in my grip with startling strength, elbows sharp, trying to break free. One of her feet stomped backward onto my toes, pain flaring bright. "Elena!" I hissed, desperate. "Look at me!" She turned her head sharply toward me. Her eyes were wide, and for the first time I saw fear there. Not fear of me, fear of being stomped. Her mouth opened, and for a second I thought she would scream. Instead, she whispered, right into my face, so close I could smell that strange incense on her breath. "It's waiting." The words were clear, chillingly calm. Then she went limp. Her entire body slackened in my arms, sudden as a power outage. Her head lolled slightly, hair falling across her face. "Elena," I said, panic surging. "Elena," she didn't respond. The service door behind her creaked. I glanced up. The door was opening wider on its own. Slowly, steadily, as if pulled from the inside by someone patient. The gap widened to a hand's width, then a forearm's. Darkness inside pressed outward, swallowing the light from the street lamp. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't see a shape. But the smell intensified, thick enough that my throat tightened. A sound came from inside, low, wet, like someone swallowing. I dragged Elena backward, half carrying her, stumbling on the uneven pavement. My feet slipped slightly on grit. My arms burned with the effort. Elena's body was dead weight, warm and heavy against me. The door continued opening. I didn't look again. I couldn't. I pulled Elena down the side street toward the brighter avenue, toward anything that felt public and human. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would split my ribs. Elena's head bounced against my shoulder. Her lips parted and closed as if she was breathing, but her eyes stayed shut. When we reached the corner where the street lamp was brighter, where the buildings felt less like a tunnel, I stopped and leaned her against the wall, trying to support her upright. "Elena," I said, shaking her gently. "Wake up." Her eyelids fluttered. She inhaled sharply, as if surfacing from deep water, and her eyes opened. This time they were hers. Confusion flooded her face. "Why are we outside?" she whispered, voice raw. "What happened?" I stared at her, chest heaving, unable to answer because the answer felt impossible. Behind us, down the side street, there was a soft, metallic sound. The service door closing. Slowly, not slamming. Closing with careful deliberation. Elena turned her head slightly, following my gaze, and her expression changed. Her eyes narrowed, as if she sensed something without understanding it. "What is that smell?" she asked. I didn't respond. I took her wrist, gently, cautiously, and pulled her sleeve up. The skin there was marked again, not the parallel scratches from before. Something else. A faint circular indentation, like a ring pressed into flesh. In the center, a small dark spot, almost like a bruise. Elena stared at it, and her face drained of color. "I didn't do that," she whispered. We went back inside through the lobby, and this time I latched the front door hard enough that it rattled. I walked Elena to the elevator, and I kept my body between her and the corners of the building where shadows pooled. On the 6th floor, when we stepped out into the hallway, I saw something that made my breath catch. Our apartment door was slightly open. Not wide. Just enough to show a thin line of darkness. The paper tape I'd placed over the latch was torn, hanging limp. I stood there, frozen, keys in my shaking hand, staring at the gap. Elena leaned close behind me. "Did you leave it open?" she asked. I pushed the door open slowly. The apartment was dark and silent, but the smell was inside now. Incense, thick, clinging, embedded in the air as if someone had burned it in every room. And on the living room floor, just inside the balcony door, were footprints. Bare footprints. Not ours. They were too large for Elena, too narrow for me. Long, thin impressions as if the feet that made them had no weight, only contact. They crossed the tile in a straight line from the balcony door toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. Then they stopped, as if whoever or whatever had walked there had simply stood still. Waiting. Aftermath. We didn't go back to sleep after that. I don't mean we lay awake together whispering, trying to make sense of things. I mean sleep became impossible, like a physical incompatibility with the space we were in. Even sitting down felt wrong, as if the apartment no longer supported the idea of rest. Elena stood in the middle of the living room, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the footprints. She didn't touch them. She didn't step closer. She just looked, breathing shallowly, her weight shifting from one foot to the other as if she was trying to stay balanced on a moving surface. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Her voice sounded thin, scraped raw. "This isn't a joke, is it?" I shook my head. Words felt useless. Anything I said would either be an understatement or a lie. The footprints didn't fade the way wet marks usually do. They stayed sharp, defined, edges clean, as if pressed into dust instead of tile. I crouched down slowly, my knees cracking loud in the silence, and held my hand a few centimeters above one of them. There was no moisture, no grit, nothing that should have left a mark. I straightened again, heart thudding. "Don't touch anything," I said. Elena nodded automatically. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, toward the bedroom, as if something there had drawn her attention. I moved before she could. I stepped into the hallway and turned on the light. The brightness felt aggressive, almost rude. It flattened shadows, exposed everything at once. The walls looked the same. The framed photos were still straight. The bedroom door was open exactly as we'd left it. I went in first. The bed was untouched. Sheets rumpled the way we'd left them when we got up. The nightstand drawer was closed. The keys were still inside, but the smell was stronger in here. It clung to the curtains, to the pillows, to the air itself, sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I checked the balcony door. Locked. The chair I'd wedged under the handle was still there, unmoved. "No one came in through here," I said, though I wasn't sure who I was reassuring. Elena stood in the doorway, pale, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Then how? I don't know." The truth settled between us, heavy and undeniable. Whatever had left those footprints hadn't needed a door. We spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table with the lights on. Neither of us drank coffee. Neither of us ate. The sky outside the window slowly lightened from black to gray, and with it came the illusion of safety, the idea that daylight could undo what darkness had done. At around 6, Elena's phone rang. Her mother. Elena flinched so hard, her chair scraped loudly across the tile. She stared at the screen as if it were a threat. I nodded. "Answer it." Her hands shook as she did. She listened, murmured reassurances, promised to visit later. I watched her face carefully for any sign of confusion, of drifting. There was none. When she hung up, she looked at me with eyes that were fully present and fully terrified. "I need to tell you something," she said. I didn't interrupt. "When I went to that woman, the fortune teller, I didn't tell you everything." She swallowed. She didn't just say something was attached to me. She said it was already halfway through, that I'd agreed to something a long time ago. My stomach tightened. Agreed how? She said agreements don't have to be conscious. That repetition counts. That routines are a form of consent. Elena pressed her fingers to her temple. She said I'd been opening a door every night without realizing it. By doing what? Elena closed her eyes. Standing on the balcony, looking up, waiting. The memory clicked into place with sickening clarity. The nights I'd gone to bed early, the times I'd woken briefly and found her on the balcony, phone in hand, staring at the sky while her mother talked. The nights I hadn't noticed at all. She said it needed a body to finish crossing, Elena whispered. That it couldn't take mine completely unless I let it. Unless I stopped resisting. "And the marks on your wrist?" I asked. Her eyes opened. They were wet now. She said that's where it holds on. I reached for her hand, hesitated, then rested my fingers lightly over her wrist without gripping. The skin was warm. Human. Familiar. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking. I thought if I listened, if I understood it, I could control it. I thought I could protect you. Something twisted painfully in my chest. "It tried to take you out of the building," I said. "It opened the service door." Elena shook her head slowly. "No, it wanted me to open it." The sun was fully up by then. The city outside resumed its usual noise. Cars, voices, a scooter revving too loud. The normal world pressed in, indifferent and oblivious. We didn't call the police. I know that sounds absurd. I know that's what everyone says they would do. But what would we have told them? That something without feet had walked through our apartment? That my wife spoke in a language no one taught her? That a door in the basement listened? Instead, we packed. Not carefully. Not neatly. We threw clothes into bags, grabbed documents, chargers, anything that felt essential. Elena avoided the bedroom as much as possible. When she did go in, she moved quickly, eyes averted, like the room might notice her attention. Before we left, I wiped the footprints away with a wet towel. They resisted. The first pass smeared them, blurring the edges but not erasing them. The second pass lightened them slightly. Only after scrubbing hard enough that my shoulder ached did they finally fade, leaving the tile looking dull and scuffed. Even then, I could still see where they'd been if I knew where to look. We stayed with my brother for 3 nights. Those nights were quiet. Too quiet. Elena slept, deeply, heavily. No sitting up. No murmuring. No movements at 3:17. I lay awake anyway, listening for sounds that never came. On the 4th night, Elena woke up screaming. Not words, just a raw animal sound that tore out of her throat and snapped me fully awake. She clutched her wrist, nails digging into her skin, eyes wide and unfocused. "It's pulling," she sobbed. "It's pulling harder." I turned on the light and saw the mark. The circular indentation on her wrist was darker now, the skin around it bruised, as if something had tightened its grip. "It followed us," she whispered. "It doesn't need the building anymore. That was just where it waited." We left my brother's place that morning. We didn't go back to the apartment. I took a leave of absence from work. Elena stopped going to the studio. Her mother was transferred to a different facility closer to extended family. We cut our routines down to the bare minimum, avoiding repetition where we could, changing paths, changing schedules, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. It helped. Or at least it slowed things down. Elena still wakes sometimes at 3:17, eyes open, breath shallow. She doesn't get up anymore. She grips my arm instead, hard enough to bruise, as if anchoring herself to something solid. The marks on her wrist fade and return in cycles. The doctor calls it stress, circulation, psychosomatic reactions. We don't correct him. I don't know if this ends. I don't know if what attached itself to Elena can be starved, confused, delayed long enough to let go. What I do know is this: the building still stands. People still live there. Lights still flicker in the hallway. Someone still burns incense late at night. And sometimes when I wake before my alarm for no reason at all, I check the time and feel my chest tighten. 13:17. Story 2. My grandma gave us night rules in her abandoned village, and one mistake almost led it. In introduction. I didn't plan the trip as a return to my childhood. I planned it as an escape, the kind you book when the city feels too tight around your ribs and your phone won't stop vibrating with reminders that you're behind on everything. A week off. Cheap train tickets. A place with bad reception and trees instead of traffic. My grandmother's village sounded perfect in that exhausted, practical way. Small, quiet, and far enough from my daily life that the map app had to zoom out twice before it made sense. My friend Luca came with me because I didn't want to go alone, and because Luca had that stubborn confidence that made any plan feel safer. He was the kind of person who could sleep on a bus seat without complaint, who could eat whatever was available, who treated problems like puzzles instead of threats. When I told him about the village, he joked, only once, and not in a way that annoyed me, about goats and old women who curse people. I told him my grandmother wasn't like that. She was strict, yes, and deeply practical. She believed in work, in keeping the stove clean, in paying bills on time, and in not talking about things you couldn't prove. She used to scold me for saying I had a bad feeling about anything. Bad feelings, she said, are what you get when you don't sleep enough or when you've skipped lunch. That was my belief as we watched the city fall away behind the train windows. Industrial edges, then fields, then the kind of low hills that look soft until you notice how quickly they swallow roads. The further we went, the more the air seemed to change. It smelled damp and metallic, like wet soil and rusted tools left out overnight. Even the light felt different, less filtered, harsher around the edges, as if there were fewer layers between the sky and the ground. Luca sat across from me, scrolling through photos on his phone until the signal weakened and he sighed and put it away. When he looked up, his expression had shifted into that blank, listening face people get when they're somewhere unfamiliar and their senses start working harder. By the time we got off at the nearest station, it was late afternoon. The station was little more than a platform and a small building with a locked door. A schedule board listed trains that would not come again until morning. The village wasn't there, not even in the distance. Just a narrow road, a bus stop with a faded route map, and fields stretching out under a sky already heavy with early evening. Wind moved through tall grass in slow waves, making a sound like fabric pulled across a rough surface. I remember that sound because it followed us for the first few minutes, constant and low, until a line of trees blocked the wind and the world went quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I had arranged for my grandmother to pick us up. That was what she'd said on the phone. I will come. Wait where the road bends. I remember the exact phrase because it didn't sound like her usual way of giving directions. She always spoke plainly. This sounded rehearsed, as if she were repeating something she'd been told to say in exactly that order, careful not to change a word. We walked anyway, following the road away from the station. Our suitcases bumped over gravel. The air cooled fast. Birds chattered in hedges. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then stopped as if it had been corrected. Luca made a quiet comment about how empty it felt, and I told him it was normal, that everyone was probably inside for dinner, that villages were like this. I heard how thin my reassurance sounded and kept talking anyway, because stopping would have meant listening to the quiet around us and admitting it wasn't normal to feel this exposed on a public road in daylight. When we reached the bend, an old stone marker, a clump of cypress trees, the road curving out of sight, my grandmother's car was already there. An aging hatchback, dusty, parked with its nose pointed toward the village like it didn't want to linger near the station. The engine was running. The headlights were off. The windows were up. The car sat so still, it looked abandoned until I noticed the faint vibration of the hood. She stepped out slowly, one hand on the doorframe, and for a second, I felt the strange disorientation of seeing someone you've loved your whole life and realizing they have become smaller. Not fragile, exactly. Compact, as if years had tightened her into something dense and hard. Her hair was pulled back the way she always wore it, but there were more gray strands than I remembered, and her face looked thinner, the skin drawn taut over cheekbones that made her expression seem sharper than it used to. The first thing that struck me, absurdly, was her hands. They looked rougher, the knuckles larger, like she'd been working outside more. "Nonna," I said and went to hug her. She accepted it with the stiff briefness of someone who doesn't want to waste time. Her arms were strong. Her coat smelled of smoke and soap and something bitter underneath, like dried leaves burned too long. Then she looked at Luca. Her eyes lingered on him too long. Not unfriendly. Evaluating, like she was checking whether he matched a description. Luca smiled and offered his hand. "Buonasera, signora." My grandmother didn't take it. She nodded once and turned back toward the car. "Put the bags in," she said, "and be quiet on the road." It wasn't harsh, but it was immediate. Luca lifted his eyebrows at me as we loaded the suitcases. I gave a small shrug, as if to say, "She's old, she's set in her ways." I was already making excuses, which I didn't notice at the time. We drove with the windows closed even though the air outside was cool and clean. My grandmother kept both hands on the steering wheel. The road narrowed quickly, the asphalt breaking into patched sections and then into hard-packed dirt. Trees pressed in on both sides. The light dimmed under their branches. Luca tried to make small talk about how pretty it was, about how quiet, but my grandmother didn't respond. Her silence wasn't the normal silence of someone focused on driving. It felt guarded, as if speaking would invite attention. I watched her face from the back seat and noticed how little she blinked. I leaned forward slightly, trying to catch what she might be listening for. The only sounds were the engine, the tires, and the faint metallic clink of something under the car when we hit a bump. My grandmother's jaw stayed tight. Her knuckles looked pale around the steering wheel. She didn't glance at the mirror. She didn't look at the fields. She stared straight ahead as if the road was the only safe thing to look at. Then, as we crested a low hill, the village appeared. It wasn't a picturesque cluster of stone houses like in travel brochures. It looked interrupted. Buildings scattered unevenly along a single main road, some with shutters closed, some with windows missing. A few roofs had collapsed inward. The church bell tower leaned slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to make you aware of gravity. We passed a small shop with a faded sign and a door chained shut. We passed a fountain that looked dry, moss crusted around its base like a green scab. A street lamp stood crooked, and the glass in its lantern looked clouded, as if it hadn't been cleaned in years. There were no people outside. No children. No old men on benches. No laundry hanging. Nothing moving except the car. Even the usual countryside sounds seemed muted, like the village swallowed them. Luca shifted in his seat. "Are people still living here?" My grandmother's voice came sharp. "Some." We turned onto a narrower lane that ran behind the main road. Her house sat near the edge of the village, with fields beyond it rolling into a dark tree line. The house itself was stone and whitewashed, like I remembered, but the yard looked different. The grass had been cut too short, almost scraped, and the hedges had been trimmed into hard geometric shapes that didn't match the natural messiness of the countryside. The gate squealed when she opened it, and she flinched as if the sound hurt. She pulled it closed again quickly, and the latch clicked with a finality that made Luca glance back down the lane. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dried herbs. Not pleasant herbs, bitter ones, medicinal, the kind you find in pharmacies and only buy when something is wrong. The walls were the same, the furniture mostly the same, but there were changes that made my stomach tighten without explanation. Curtains pulled closed even though it wasn't fully dark, a pale line of salt along the inside of one windowsill, and small pieces of paper tucked into the corners of door frames, folded in precise triangles with creases so sharp they looked ironed. Luca noticed too. He didn't say anything, but his eyes moved, tracking details, trying to decide whether this was a cultural thing, an old person thing, or something else. My grandmother took off her coat and hung it on a hook with careful precision, as if the angle mattered. "You will sleep in the front room," she said, pointing down a hallway. "Both of you." No wandering. "You eat when I say. You wash before bed." "That's fine," I said quickly, forcing an easy tone. "We're guests." She stared at me. "Not guests," she said. "You are under my roof." The way she said it made the phrase feel less like hospitality and more like a boundary. Then she added, in a lower voice that made Luca stop moving for a second, "And at night, you follow rules." I tried to laugh it off, because laughter is what people do when they want to turn something sharp into something safe. "Rules?" My grandmother didn't smile. Her face looked carved, the lines around her mouth deepened by something I couldn't name. "Yes," she said, "because you don't know this place anymore." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving us standing in the entryway with our bags, the air in the house thick with bitter herbs and old wood. Luca leaned close to me and whispered, barely moving his lips, "What rules?" I didn't have an answer. I watched the hallway, the closed curtains, the salt line, the folded papers, and felt a slow pressure build behind my sternum, like the beginning of a fever. Outside, somewhere in the village, a door closed. Not slammed, closed gently. The sound traveled through the quiet like a message, and my grandmother, from the kitchen, called out without raising her voice, as if she'd heard something else entirely. "Before the sun is gone," she said, "I will tell you what not to do." Background. My grandmother's name is Adelina, but no one in the village called her that. They called her Signora I, or simply your nonna, the way people speak about someone who is both familiar and kept at a distance. When I was a child, spending summers there, I never questioned it. In my memory, the village had been small but alive, women sweeping doorsteps in the morning, men fixing fences, radios playing behind shutters, the smell of tomato sauce drifting from kitchens. I remembered sunlight on stone, the constant buzz of insects trapped in the heat, and my grandmother's voice calling me in for water when my lips cracked. That memory was the reason I'd suggested the trip to Luca so confidently. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was more like a fact I carried. This place is safe because it is mine. But the village we arrived in didn't match the one in my head. It wasn't just that buildings were empty. It was the feeling of interruption, of routines cut off mid-motion and never resumed. Even inside my grandmother's house, everything was too controlled, too sealed, too deliberate, like she'd been trying to keep the outside from soaking in. She fed us early before the last light had gone from the sky, and she did it with the same practical efficiency she'd always had. Bread, soup, slices of cheese that smelled sharp and earthy. Luca tried to compliment it. My grandmother nodded once and kept working. The kitchen window was covered by a curtain so thick it blocked the fading sunlight, and the air in the room felt warm but stale, like it had been closed up for days. While we ate, she watched us more than she ate herself. Her eyes moved between our faces and our hands, as if our small habits mattered. The way Luca held his spoon. The way I leaned forward when I listened. It made me suddenly aware of my body in a way I didn't like. as if my posture could be read like handwriting. When Luca asked how long it had been since I'd visited, my grandmother answered for him. "Too long," she said. Her voice wasn't accusing. It was simply flat, factual. And then, after a pause that stretched, she added, "Long enough for you to forget." I felt my throat tighten. Forget what? She didn't answer right away. She stood, cleared our plates, rinsed them quickly in a basin, and set them to dry with their edges aligned. The sound of ceramic against ceramic was too loud in the house. Luca and I sat at the table, hands still, listening to water run, listening to the floorboards creak as she moved. Finally, she turned back to us and rested both palms on the table. The gesture was familiar. She'd always done that when she was about to give instructions like a teacher. "These are not stories," she said. "These are rules." Luca glanced at me, eyebrows slightly raised, but he didn't speak. I could feel his curiosity pressing against his restraint. My grandmother continued, still calm. "When it is dark, you do not go outside. Not for air, not to smoke, not because you heard something. The yard is not yours at night." I almost asked what she meant by yours, but something in her tone stopped me. "If you need the toilet, you use the one inside the house," she went on. "You do not go to the back room. You do not open the storage door. You do not look out of the back window." Luca's mouth parted slightly, then closed. I could see him forming a joke and swallowing it. My grandmother's eyes flicked to him. "No jokes," she said, as if he'd spoken. He nodded once. She pointed a finger toward the hallway. "You will sleep in the front room. Door closed. Curtain closed. If you wake and it is quiet, you stay in bed. If you wake and you hear footsteps, you stay in bed. If you wake and you hear someone call your name, you stay in bed." My stomach dipped. "Nonna," she cut me off with a raised hand, not angry, just final. "Listen." The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. I became aware of the house's small noises, the refrigerator's hum, the distant tick of a clock, the faint settling of wood as the temperature dropped outside. "One more," she said. "If you wake and you see light under the door, you do not open it." Luca finally spoke, carefully. "Who would be outside the door?" My grandmother's gaze didn't waver. "Not someone you know." The words landed heavy. Luca's face shifted, his confidence faltering into something closer to uncertainty. I felt a cold prickle rise on my arms, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "This is because the village is empty?" I asked. "Because of thieves?" My grandmother exhaled through her nose, almost like she was tired of the question. "Thieves take what they can carry," she said. "This is not that." She straightened and walked to the cupboard. From a shelf, she took out a small tin of salt, the kind used for cooking, and placed it on the table between us. "You keep it near the bed," she said. "If you must get up, you touch it first. Just touch. Remember you are in your skin." My mouth went dry. "Nonna, what happened here?" For the first time since we'd arrived, her expression cracked, not into softness, but into something like grief held under pressure. Her eyes looked older suddenly. "People leave," she said quietly. "Then rules become more important." She didn't explain further. She didn't tell us about accidents or rumors or anything that could have given the rules a shape. That absence was its own kind of explanation. It suggested that what she was protecting us from was not something you could speak about plainly without inviting it closer. After dinner, she showed us the front room. It used to be my room as a child, the one with the window facing the road. Now the bed was narrower, and the furniture had been shifted so that the wardrobe partially blocked the window, as if to limit the view. The curtain was thick and smelled faintly of smoke and herbs. On the bedside table, she placed the tin of salt, then added a small glass of water. "Not for drinking," she said, and left before we could ask. When she closed the door behind her, the click of the latch sounded too loud, too intentional. Luca set his bag down and looked around. "Okay," he whispered, because even he seemed to sense that speaking normally felt wrong. "This is different," I nodded, though my thoughts were sliding in circles. My grandmother had always been strict, but not like this. Not rule-heavy, not afraid of windows. We unpacked quietly. Outside, through the curtain, the last of the daylight faded. The village slipped into darkness without the usual transition of evening sounds. No distant conversation. No clatter of dishes from other homes. No radios. Just a slow, expanding silence that pressed against the walls. At some point, a bell rang from the church tower, one single dull note that sounded wrong, like metal struck gently. It didn't repeat. It was like a test. Luca sat on the bed and pulled out his phone. He had no signal. He tried again, moving the phone around like an antenna. Nothing. "I guess we really are off-grid," he muttered. I didn't answer. I was watching the line under the door where the hallway light should have been visible. There was no light. Just darkness. Later, when my grandmother said goodnight, she didn't enter the room fully. She stood in the doorway, her face half hidden in shadow, and repeated the rules again in shorter form, as if sealing them into place. Then she added something new, something that made the hairs on my neck lift. "If you hear knocking," she said, "do not answer it, even if it sounds polite." "Knocking where?" Luca asked. My grandmother's eyes narrowed slightly. "Anywhere." She closed the door. For a long time after, Luca and I lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling. I could hear him breathing, controlled, trying to keep it steady. My own breath felt too loud in my chest. We were adults in a locked room in my grandmother's house, and yet my body felt the same way it had when I was a child, hiding under a blanket after hearing something outside. Small, exposed, listening for proof that the night had teeth. And somewhere beyond the curtain, the village remained silent, as if it was waiting for the rules to be broken. First, irregularities. The first night didn't begin with anything dramatic. That was almost worse. Luca and I lay awake longer than we admitted to each other, listening to the house settle. Old houses make noise even when nothing is happening. Wood contracting, pipes ticking, distant movements that don't mean anything. I kept telling myself that was all it was. Normal sounds made strange only because my grandmother had loaded the dark with rules. At some point, Luca's breathing changed. Slower. Deeper. Sleep. I envied him for it, but it didn't last long. The silence outside the house wasn't complete. It was selective. I could hear insects close to the window, the faint rasp of something moving through grass. But there were gaps, unnatural pauses where sound should have continued and didn't. Each pause felt deliberate, like a held breath. I checked my phone. Still no signal. The screen's glow felt too bright, too intrusive, so I turned it face down on the table and lay there with my eyes open. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were not loud. They weren't heavy boots or the dramatic creak of floorboards. They sounded like bare feet or soft shoes moving slowly across packed earth. Not on the road. Closer. Somewhere between the house and the hedges. I felt my chest tighten immediately, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. My grandmother's words replayed themselves in my head, uninvited. "If you wake and you hear footsteps, you stay in bed." The steps stopped. I waited for them to continue, to fade away, to be explained by distance. They didn't. They lingered in that uncomfortable space where you know someone or something is standing still. Then Luca shifted beside me. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The fact that he heard it, too, stripped away my last attempt at denial. "Yes," I said, barely louder than breath. We lay frozen, staring at the ceiling. I counted my breaths because not counting made me feel like I was falling. The footsteps started again, slower now. Closer. They moved along the front of the house, passing beneath the window. I couldn't see them, but I could tell where they were by the sound alone, the way you can track someone in another room without seeing them. When they stopped again, they were directly in front of our window. The curtain didn't move. Nothing scratched at the glass. No shadow crossed the fabric. Just the sense of presence, thick enough that my scalp prickled. I thought of all the nights I'd slept in this room as a child, the window open, the sounds of the village drifting in. I had never been afraid of the dark here. That memory felt alien now, like it belonged to someone else. A soft sound followed, not knocking. Not yet. Breathing. It was faint, irregular, and unmistakably close. Someone was standing outside our window, breathing through their mouth, slow and patient. Luca's hand found my arm in the dark. His grip was tight enough to hurt. I didn't pull away. The breathing stopped. For a few seconds, nothing happened. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard through the walls. Then came the knock. It wasn't on the window. It was on the wall. 3 gentle taps, spaced evenly, polite in the way my grandmother had warned us about. Not demanding. Not aggressive. As if whoever was outside expected to be answered. Luca sucked in a sharp breath and clamped his mouth shut immediately, like he'd nearly made a sound by accident. I could feel his whole body trembling through the bed. Another knock. Same rhythm. Same careful restraint. My eyes drifted to the door without me telling them to. The hallway beyond it was dark, but I could see a thin line of pale light under the doorframe now. Light that hadn't been there before. It wasn't bright. It was dull and yellowish like an old bulb turned low. It didn't flicker. It just existed, steady and quiet. If you wake and you see light under the door, my grandmother had said, you do not open it. The knocking stopped. The light remained. Seconds stretched. Minutes, maybe. Time felt unreliable. Then a voice spoke. It was close enough that it felt like it came from inside the walls rather than outside the house. It said my name. Not loudly. Not softly. Exactly the way Luca would say it if he wanted my attention without waking someone else. My stomach dropped so violently I thought I might be sick. Luca's grip tightened. He shook his head once, barely perceptible, a silent command not to answer. The voice tried again. My dear, it said, and this time it sounded like my grandmother. The same cadence. The same slight roughness. Even the pause between words was right. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from fear alone, but from the violation of it. Something was wearing familiar sounds like a mask, and it knew how to use them. No one you know, my grandmother had said. The light under the door brightened slightly. The handle on the door did not move. There was no attempt to force entry. Whatever was out there didn't need to rush. It behaved like time was on its side. The voice sighed, just once, a sound thick with disappointment. Then it spoke again in a tone that made my skin crawl. We only need one of you. Luca made a small, involuntary sound in his throat, halfway between a sob and a cough. I pressed my hand over his mouth without thinking, terrified that any response would be enough. The light under the door dimmed. The presence receded, not abruptly, not fully, but enough that the pressure in the room eased by a fraction. We stayed exactly where we were until dawn. Neither of us slept. When the first gray light filtered through the curtain, the village outside was unchanged. Quiet, empty, ordinary in the way places look when you've survived something inside them. Luca finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Your grandmother knows, he said. I nodded slowly, and for the first time since arriving, I understood that the rules were not about fear. They were about survival, escalating tension. In the morning, my grandmother acted as if the night had been ordinary. Not cheerful, not relaxed. Just functional, as if nothing had happened that required explanation. She was already up when we stepped into the kitchen, hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, kettle steaming. The table was set neatly, bread sliced, a knife placed with its blade facing inward. The curtain over the kitchen window was still drawn, even though daylight was fully present outside. The normality made me feel unsteady. It suggested either that what we'd heard was common enough to ignore, or that acknowledging it gave it power. I didn't know which was worse. Luca looked worse than I did. His eyes were red at the edges, his face slightly puffy from holding himself tight for hours. He tried to speak casually when he greeted my grandmother, but his voice cracked on the second word. She glanced at him, then at me, and her gaze lingered just long enough to communicate that she saw everything. You slept, she said, not a question. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Saying no felt like admitting weakness. Saying yes felt like lying in a way that could be dangerous. My grandmother nodded once, as if the answer didn't matter, and slid mugs of something dark and bitter toward us. It wasn't coffee. It smelled like roasted roots. Drink, she said. It helps you stay inside yourself. Luca's hand hesitated above the mug. He looked at me. I nodded slightly and we both drank. It tasted horrible. Earthy, smoky, with a sharp medicinal aftertaste that coated my tongue and made my throat feel slightly numb. My stomach tightened around it as if my body didn't want it, but after a few minutes I felt an odd steadiness settle into my muscles. Not calm, more like a dulling of edges, the way cold water makes your skin less sensitive. My grandmother watched us finish, then finally spoke about the village in a way she hadn't the night before. "People don't come here anymore," she said. "And those who stay for reasons." "Why is it empty?" Luca asked, careful, polite. My grandmother's fingers tightened around the handle of the kettle. "It began slowly," she said. "A family leaves. Another follows. Then the shops close. Then the church rings for no one." Her eyes flicked toward the curtain, toward the outside. "Some say it is economy. Some say it is sickness. People always want a simple story." I felt my pulse in my throat. "And the truth?" My grandmother held my gaze for a long moment. "The truth is that nights here are claimed," she said. The sentence sat in the kitchen like smoke. Luca didn't speak. I didn't either. The refrigerator clicked on behind us, and the sound was too loud. My grandmother stood and began wiping an already clean counter, repetitive motions that seemed more ritual than chore. "You did not open the door," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No," I said. Luca shook his head quickly. "No." My grandmother's shoulders eased by a fraction. "Good. How did you know?" Luca asked. My grandmother looked at him as if the answer should be obvious. "Because you are alive," she said. After breakfast, she gave us work to do, like she always had when I was a child. Not heavy labor, just tasks that kept our hands busy, carrying firewood from the shed, sweeping the front steps, helping her sort jars in the pantry. I understood what she was doing, keeping us in daylight routines, anchoring us, keeping our minds from replaying the night. But even in daylight, the village felt wrong. Luca and I walked down the main road to stretch our legs after lunch. My grandmother didn't forbid it. She only said, "Be back before the sun lowers," and the way she said it made time feel like a closing gate. The village looked even more abandoned in daylight. In the sun, you could see the details: cracked plaster, weeds forcing their way through stone, doors swollen with damp. Some houses had symbols scratched into their frames, simple marks, not decorative, repeated with small variations. I noticed them only because I wasn't looking for them. They were at eye level, at wrist level, on corners where hands might brush without thinking. They looked like the kind of marks people carve to remember something important when paper isn't safe. We passed the fountain. It wasn't dry. There was water in it, stagnant, dark, with a thin skin of algae. Something floated near the edge, pale and soft. I couldn't tell what it was and didn't want to get close enough to find out. We passed the shop with the chain door. Luca tugged on the chain once, lightly, more out of habit than curiosity. It didn't move. The metal was cold, and when he withdrew his hand, he wiped his fingers on his jeans as if the chain had left something on him. "There's no one," Luca murmured, scanning windows. "Not even curtains moving." I looked at the church tower. Up close, I could see that the bell rope had been cut. It hung in two separate lengths, frayed ends swaying slightly in the breeze. A sound came from behind the church. Not footsteps, not voices. A soft, repetitive thud, like someone hitting something heavy against wood. Luca stopped. His eyes widened. "You hear that?" I nodded. We walked toward it slowly, drawn by curiosity and something darker, an urge to confirm that something living existed here besides us. Behind the church was a small yard with tall grass and a line of trees. The sound came from a shed near the back, its door slightly ajar. Light leaked from inside. Luca took a step closer. I caught his sleeve. "No." He looked at me, annoyed, then saw my expression and went still. The sound stopped instantly. The shed door didn't move. A second later, the light inside went out. We stood there, breath held, listening. Nothing. Then, from the darkness of the shed doorway, a voice spoke. It was quiet and conversational, like someone addressing us from a few meters away in daylight. "Lost?" Luca's face drained of color. He turned his head slowly toward me, as if checking that he hadn't imagined it. The voice wasn't my grandmother's this time. It was younger. Male, maybe. But the tone was familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. It sounded like someone trying to imitate friendliness. We didn't answer. We backed away from the shed without turning our backs fully. The grass brushed our ankles, leaving cold dampness on our skin. Luca's breathing was rapid, shallow. The voice chuckled softly. Not amusement. Something else. Something that sounded like disappointment held in patience. Before the sun goes, it said, you should hurry. Luca's hand found my arm, grip bruising. We didn't run, because running felt like admitting it had the power to chase. We walked faster, steady, forcing our bodies to look calm even as our hearts hammered. We returned to my grandmother's house with the sun still high, and yet the air already felt colder, as if daylight was losing. My grandmother took one look at our faces and didn't ask where we'd been. She simply nodded toward the sink. Wash, she said. Arms too, we washed. Soap burned our skin. The water was icy. That evening, before dark, my grandmother did something I hadn't seen her do as a child. She moved through the house with a small bowl of salt and scattered it along thresholds. Not a thick line, just a fine dusting, almost invisible unless you looked closely. She rubbed some into the corners of windowsills. She tapped the bowl against wood 3 times at each doorway, rhythmic and exact. Luca watched her, silent. I watched my own hands, noticing they were trembling slightly. When she finished, she placed the bowl on the kitchen table and looked at us. Tonight, she said, it will try harder. My throat tightened. Why? My grandmother's eyes flicked to Luca, then back to me. Because you brought someone new, she said. And because it heard you last night. We didn't speak, Luca said quickly. My grandmother's mouth tightened. It does not need words, she said. It needs attention. She turned off the lights earlier than necessary. She closed shutters. She locked doors. The house became a sealed box. We went to the front room before full darkness, as instructed. The tin of salt sat on the table. The glass of water sat beside it, untouched. Luca lay on the bed fully dressed. So did I. Neither of us pretended we would sleep. The village outside fell silent again, the way it had the night before, but now I understood the silence wasn't emptiness. It was listening, and as the last hint of light disappeared from behind the curtain, I felt the dull herbal drink in my stomach like a stone, and I waited for the first sound that would prove the rules weren't enough. Critical incident. The night began earlier than the others. Not because the sun set faster, but because the darkness felt impatient. It pressed in against the house before the sky had fully dimmed, blurring the boundary between evening and night until time itself felt unreliable. The house absorbed it without resistance. The thick curtains, the shutters, the sealed doors, all of it turned the interior into a contained space where sound carried too clearly and every movement felt exposed. Luca lay on the bed staring at the ceiling. I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he kept swallowing like his mouth was dry. I sat on the edge of the mattress with my hands resting flat on my thighs, fingers spread, grounding myself in the pressure. The tin of salt sat between us on the table, lid slightly dented, reflecting a dull, distorted version of the room's lamplight. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. We didn't speak. Speaking felt like an announcement. At some point, the lamplight dimmed slightly, not flickering, not failing, just lowering, as if the power had sagged under a sudden weight. The shadows thickened along the corners of the room, especially near the wardrobe that blocked part of the window. The air grew colder in uneven patches, brushing against my ankles and wrists like passing breath. I checked my phone out of habit. Still no signal. The time display glowed faintly, its numbers sharp and indifferent. 22:41. Too early, I thought, and the thought brought no comfort. It only meant we had more night ahead of us. A sound came from the hallway. Not footsteps this time. A soft scrape, irregular, like something being dragged gently across the floor. It stopped, then started again, closer. I could hear the grain of the wood beneath it, the way it caught slightly on uneven boards. Luca's eyes snapped toward the door. He didn't move otherwise. His body had gone rigid, muscles locked as if motion itself might draw attention. The scrape stopped directly outside our door. The light under the door was already there. It hadn't appeared suddenly. It had simply existed, a thin line of yellow-white illumination that didn't match any lamp in the house. The handle did not turn. Instead, there was a pause long enough for my heartbeat to stutter. Then came the knock. Not on the door. On the wood beside it. 2 taps this time. Slower than the night before. Testing. Luca's breath hitched. I reached for the salt tin without looking, pressed my fingers against the cold metal lid the way my grandmother had instructed. The sensation grounded me just enough to keep from bolting upright. The knocking stopped. The scrape resumed, retreating a short distance down the hallway. Then it returned, stopping again in front of our door. A different sound followed. A whisper. It wasn't directed at us. It sounded like someone speaking to themselves, just loud enough to be overheard. "So careful," the voice murmured. "She taught you well." My stomach clenched painfully. The voice was low, indistinct in age or gender, but the familiarity of its tone was wrong. It carried the intimacy of someone who believed they belonged here. Luca shook his head slowly, eyes wide, silently begging me not to respond. The voice continued, closer now, as if the speaker had leaned toward the door. "We can smell him," it said. "He does not belong to this soil." Luca's hand clenched into the blanket. His knuckles whitened. I felt a surge of anger cut through my fear, sharp and sudden. The implication of it, the way the voice reduced him to something out of place, something consumable. The salt tin rattled slightly under my fingers. I hadn't realized I was gripping it so tightly. The voice sighed. A sound came from deeper in the house, a door opening slowly, hinges whispering. I recognized it with sick certainty. The back room. The storage door my grandmother had forbidden us from opening. I stared at the door of our room, my mind screaming that she must be wrong, that old houses make strange noises, that this could be anything. But Luca's eyes were fixed on the ceiling now, tracking sound through the structure like prey. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the house. Heavy, measured. Not 1 set. 2. The scrape joined them again, keeping pace, as if whatever made that sound moved differently from the rest. The voice outside our door spoke again, softer. "You should stop her," it said. "She's old. She forgets how much it hurts." My throat closed. "Nonna," I whispered before I could stop myself. The word barely left my lips. The reaction was immediate. The light under the door flared brighter, flooding the gap with harsh illumination. The knocking came back, faster now, sharp and impatient. The handle rattled once, not turning, just testing the resistance. From the back of the house, my grandmother's voice rose. It wasn't panicked. It was furious. "Stay where you are," she shouted, and the sound of her voice cut through the night like a blade. "You are not invited." The footsteps paused. Then came laughter. It didn't come from one place. It rippled through the house, overlapping echoes that bounced off walls and ceilings, making it impossible to tell how many there were. It was soft laughter, almost affectionate, and it raised goosebumps along my arms. "She still thinks doors matter," a voice said, amused. Something struck the back wall of the house. Once. Hard. The entire room shuddered. Dust sifted down from the ceiling in a fine, dry rain. Luca sat up instinctively, then froze, remembering the rules. His breathing turned ragged. Another impact. Closer. The wardrobe creaked as if something heavy leaned against the outside wall near it. I could hear my grandmother moving now, fast, determined. Her footsteps were unmistakable, heavier than the others, filled with purpose. She was chanting something under her breath, words clipped and urgent, not quite forming sentences. The light under our door flickered for the first time. Off, on, off, on. The handle turned. Just slightly. The latch held. A cold sensation crawled across my ankles, rising slowly, as if something on the other side of the door had found a way to reach under it without crossing the threshold. Luca made a choking sound. I pressed my hand against his arm, trying to keep him anchored. The knocking stopped. Silence dropped suddenly, so complete it made my ears ring. Then the voice spoke again, right outside the door, clear and close. "You already gave us one," it said. "You can give us another." My heart slammed painfully against my ribs. From the back of the house came a sharp crack, wood splitting. my grandmother screamed. Not a word. A sound of pure exertion and pain. Without thinking, without permission from fear or rules, I moved. I grabbed the salt tin, flung the door open, and stepped into the hallway. The light vanished instantly. The hallway was dark, completely dark, but I could feel movement all around me, a pressure that pushed against my skin from every direction at once. The air was thick, buzzing, filled with overlapping breaths that did not belong to human lungs. I ran toward the back of the house, guided by instinct and the sound of my grandmother's struggle. The floor was icy under my bare feet. My heart felt like it might burst. I saw her near the storage door. She was small against it, braced with her shoulder, one foot planted, both hands pressed flat against the wood as if holding something back from the other side. The door bowed inward under the force against it, the hinges screaming. Her face was contorted with effort, teeth bared, eyes blazing. "Salt!" she gasped when she saw me. "Now!" I hurled the tin toward her. It burst open midair, scattering white across the floor in a chaotic spray. Some of it hit the door. The pressure eased instantly. The door slammed shut from the inside. The house exhaled. The sounds vanished, not faded, vanished, leaving behind a silence so abrupt it made me dizzy. My grandmother slid down the door and sat heavily on the floor, chest heaving. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, disappearing into the lines of her face. Luca appeared behind me, pale, shaking, alive. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Then my grandmother looked up at me, eyes sharp despite the pain. "Now you know," she said. "Aftermath, we left before sunrise. Not because my grandmother told us to, and not because anything chased us out. We left because staying felt like tempting something that had already learned too much about us. The house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a line that had been held just long enough for us to escape, and no longer. My grandmother insisted on walking us to the gate. She had cleaned the cut on her forehead and wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from an old towel. Her movements were slower now, but her posture was rigid, controlled by will more than strength. She carried the empty salt tin in one hand as if it still had weight. The village was gray and indistinct in the early morning. Fog clung low to the ground, pooling between houses, softening edges. It muffled sound in a way that made the world feel padded, unreal. I could see moisture beaded on doors and windows, but no curtains moved. No lights turned on. The village did not wake with the sun. Luca kept close to me. He hadn't spoken since the night before. His eyes darted constantly, scanning doorways, corners, the line where fog met stone. His body was still running on adrenaline, and I could feel it in the way he moved, too fast, too alert, like prey that hasn't yet accepted safety. At the gate, my grandmother stopped. "You will not come back," she said. It wasn't a request. It wasn't said with sadness. It was instruction. I swallowed. My mouth felt dry and raw. "Nonna!" She raised her hand. This time, the gesture wasn't cutting me off. It was protective, almost gentle. "You remember this place as it was," she said. "That memory is safer than the truth now." Luca found his voice at last. It came out strained. "What are they?" My grandmother's eyes moved past him, past me, toward the line of trees beyond the fields. The fog there looked thicker, heavier, as if it resisted the light. "They are what remains," she said. "When people leave without closing things properly." That was all she offered. No names, no origins, no explanation that could be written down and understood. Just a consequence. She took my face in her hands then, her palms rough and warm, and pressed her forehead briefly against mine. I felt her breath on my cheek, smelled smoke and herbs and something older, like earth turned too many times. "You did well," she said quietly. "You listened." Then she stepped back, unlatched the gate, and waved us through. She did not watch us leave. The walk back to the station felt longer than the walk in. The fog thinned as we moved away from the village, and with it came sound. Birds, distant traffic, the low hum of a world that continued without rules carved into door frames. I didn't realize how tightly my muscles had been locked until they began to ache with release. When we reached the platform, Luca sat down hard on the bench and put his head in his hands. We almost, he started, then stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I sat beside him close enough that our shoulders touched. The physical contact helped, a reminder of weight and heat and solidity. I should never have brought you, I said. Luca shook his head slowly. You didn't know. That was true. And it wasn't. Some part of me had known enough to hesitate, enough to feel the wrongness before it took shape. That part of me would carry the guilt anyway. The train arrived late. When it did, its noise felt violent after the quiet we'd been inside. We boarded without speaking. As the train pulled away, I looked back once, toward the hills where the village hid. I couldn't see it. It was as if it had folded itself back into the landscape, invisible to anyone not already marked by it. For weeks after, I woke at night convinced I heard knocking. Not loud. Polite. Measured. The kind that waits to be invited. I learned to stay still in bed, to breathe slowly until the feeling passed. Luca had similar nights. We talked about them once, briefly, and then agreed not to compare details. Comparison felt dangerous, like aligning two broken mirrors. My grandmother stopped answering her phone. At first, I told myself it was the reception, or her stubbornness, or the simple fact of age. Then letters I sent came back unopened, marked with stamps that didn't explain anything clearly. I tried to look the village up online. There were photos, years old, comments arguing about population numbers and municipal boundaries. Nothing recent. Nothing helpful. I don't know if my grandmother is still alive. I don't know if the rules still hold, or if something finally broke through them. What I do know is this. Some places do not want to be remembered incorrectly, and some protections only work as long as everyone involved believes in the boundary. I believe now. Because even far from that village, even surrounded by noise and light and people who don't know what waits in quiet places, there are nights when the world feels too still, and on those nights, I stay exactly where I am. Story 3. I got a help me text from an unknown number. Now, something touches me. Every night. Introduction. I remember the exact moment it started, not because it was dramatic, but because it was painfully ordinary. I was standing on a crowded subway platform after work, half listening to the automated announcements and half thinking about nothing at all. My phone vibrated in my hand. I assumed it was a notification from work or a delivery update. Something routine. Something expected. I glanced down without stopping my train of thought. The message was from an unknown number. It contained only 2 words. Help me. No punctuation. No emoji. No follow-up. I stopped walking. Around me, people moved with practiced impatience, brushing past my shoulder, their coats damp from the evening rain. The smell of metal, wet concrete, and overheated brakes hung in the air. Somewhere down the platform, a train screamed as it slowed, but the sound felt distant, muffled, as if I were underwater. I stared at the screen longer than made sense. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was irritation. Unknown numbers sent spam all the time. Wrong numbers happened. I typed, "Who is this?" and then deleted it. I typed nothing at all. The message felt incomplete, like someone had stopped mid-sentence. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility to fill in the rest. The phone vibrated again. Same number. Same message. Help me. My thumb hovered over the screen. I felt a strange tightness at the base of my neck, the kind you get when you realize someone is standing too close behind you. I turned instinctively, scanning faces, but no one was looking at me. Everyone was absorbed in their own small emergencies. I locked the phone and put it in my pocket. That should have been the end of it. On the train ride home, I kept telling myself the same rational explanations. Automated scam. Glitch. Someone mistyped a number and was too embarrassed to correct it. I even laughed quietly to myself at how easily my mood had shifted. 2 words. That was all it took. But my body didn't agree with my logic. My shoulders stayed tense the entire ride. I felt aware of my hands in a way I usually wasn't, of the pressure of my feet against the floor, of every vibration of the train through the soles of my shoes. When my phone buzzed again in my pocket, I didn't take it out. I already knew what it would say. At home, the apartment felt smaller than usual. The light seemed too bright. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder, more intrusive. I set my phone on the kitchen counter face down, as if turning it away could make it forget me. I made dinner without appetite and ate standing up. I washed my hands longer than necessary, watching the water run over my fingers until the skin wrinkled. I kept waiting for the phone to vibrate again. It didn't. That absence bothered me more than the messages had. Later, as I lay in bed scrolling mindlessly through news I didn't care about, my phone buzzed once more. This time I didn't hesitate. I flipped it over immediately. Unknown number. But the message was different. It was longer. Not by much. I can feel you reading this. A cold wave moved through me, slow and deliberate, starting at my scalp and sliding down my spine. My mouth went dry. I sat up in bed, suddenly aware of how quiet the apartment was. No traffic noise. No neighbors moving around. Just the soft electrical hum of the building, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else stops. I checked the locks on the door. I checked the window. Everything was exactly as it should be. The phone buzzed again while it was still in my hand. "Thank you for noticing me." I didn't reply. I couldn't. My fingers felt clumsy, disconnected from my thoughts. I turned the phone off completely and set it on the nightstand, screen facing the wall. My heart was beating too fast, but not in the way it does when you're startled. This was deeper, heavier, like my body was reacting to something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. That night I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to the building settle, to distant pipes clicking, to the faint whistle of wind through a barely sealed window frame. Every sensation felt amplified. Every shadow in the room felt more defined. I kept thinking about those two words. Help me, not help us. Not help, please. Just help me. Singular. Specific. Directed. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. By the end of the week, I knew I was wrong. Dimmer background. I didn't block the number right away. That detail matters because it's the kind of thing people judge you for after. They say, "Why didn't you just block it? Why didn't you change your number? Why didn't you call the police?" Those questions assume you understand what you're dealing with from the beginning. They assume fear arrives fully formed. Mine didn't. I live alone in a modest apartment on the 4th floor of a building that looks like 100 other buildings in the city. Painted concrete, narrow balconies, a lobby that always smells faintly of detergent and damp stone. I work in an office where my days are measured by spreadsheets, calendar invites, and the slow erosion of attention that comes from staring at screens too long. Nothing about my life was dramatic. I'd built it that way on purpose. Predictable routines, predictable commutes, predictable... So when the messages began, I treated them like a nuisance with a story attached. The next morning, after the sleepless night, I went to work as if nothing had happened. The sky was low and gray, the kind of weather that turns everything slightly flat. My phone stayed in my pocket. I kept telling myself that turning it off had ended it, that whoever was sending those texts would get bored. At 10:12, while I was answering an email, my phone vibrated on the desk. I stared at it for a full second before picking it up. My hands felt too warm, palms slightly damp. I told myself it could be anyone. My bank, my sister, a delivery service. Unknown number. Help me. The same two words, identical spacing. Seeing them again in the bright, ordinary light of an office made them feel even more out of place, like a stain on clean paper. I didn't answer. I set the phone down and tried to continue typing, but my focus kept slipping. Every time someone walked behind my chair, my shoulders tightened. Every time my screen reflected movement, my mind interpreted it as attention. At 12:47, another vibration. Help me. At 15:03. Help me. Each time the message arrived with the same quiet certainty, as if the sender was checking a clock. There were no threats, no demands for money, no links. Just the same request repeated, stripped of context. It was too consistent to be a wrong number and too strange to be normal spam. I finally did the sensible thing and asked my coworker Marta, who sits 2 desks away and has the kind of calm competence I envy, if she'd ever received texts like that. I didn't show her the screen. I just asked casually like it was a curiosity. She frowned. "Like a scam?" she said. "Maybe," I replied. "Block it," she said immediately. already returning to her monitor, as if the solution was as simple as closing a pop-up. I nodded. I even opened the contact options. My thumb hovered over block, and I didn't press it. I can't explain that without sounding irrational. The closest I can get is this. Blocking it felt like acknowledging it. Like turning the key in a lock that might not open again if I needed it to. The messages had moved under my skin in a way that wasn't logical. I wanted absurdly to understand who was on the other side before I severed the line. That evening I took a longer route home. Not because I thought someone was following me, but because the idea of my usual path suddenly felt too exposed, too predictable. I walked through busier streets with brighter storefronts, letting crowds press around me, letting the noise of people talking and scooters passing drown out my thoughts. I kept my phone in my hand the whole time, screen dark, thumb resting on the edge. At 18:21, as I stood at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. But the message was new. "You're changing your route." My vision narrowed. The street noise seemed to pull away, leaving only the rush of blood in my ears. I looked up quickly, scanning faces. People waiting, people walking, a man on a bicycle weaving through traffic. No one was looking at me. No one held a phone up. No one smiled. The light changed. People surged forward. I moved with them because stopping felt like painting a target on my own body. I got home and locked the door behind me, then checked it twice, then a third time, pressing on it as if my weight could prove it was solid. I pulled the curtains closed even though it was still early. The room dimmed. The apartment felt like a box I'd sealed myself inside. I went into the bathroom and stared at my own face in the mirror. My eyes looked too bright. The skin under them looked thin, slightly bruised by lack of sleep. My phone vibrated again on the kitchen counter. I walked to it slowly, every step deliberate. "Please don't hide." Then, almost immediately, "I don't want to be alone anymore." I stood in the middle of my kitchen, phone in my hand, and felt something shift in me. The fear was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't the sharp fear of a threat. It was the dull, nauseating fear of being known. Of having small private choices, routes, curtains, silence, observed and commented on. That night I did block the number. The screen confirmed it. Contact blocked, messages muted, the neat, digital illusion of control. I went to bed believing that would be enough. At 3:06 my phone buzzed. I had left it on the nightstand, face down, because turning it off every night felt like admitting defeat. The vibration rattled the wood softly. I flipped it over. New number. Same message. "Help me." I stared at it until my eyes burned. Then another buzz. "You can't block what's already inside." My throat tightened so hard it hurt to swallow. I sat up and looked around my bedroom, suddenly hyper-aware of the corners, the closet door, the thin strip of darkness beneath it. The air felt colder than it should have. The phone buzzed again. This is how I stay warm. I turned every light on in the apartment and stayed awake until morning, not because light made me feel safe, but because the act of turning it on felt like doing something, like resisting. By the end of that second night, the messages had stopped being a nuisance. They had become a schedule, and my body, without asking my permission, started living around them. First, irregularities. The messages didn't escalate immediately. That was the most unsettling part. If they had turned aggressive, threatening, or obscene, I could have framed them as harassment. Something with rules. Something with procedures. Instead, they settled into my days like a second, unwanted routine, subtle enough that I could almost pretend it was normal. Almost. They arrived at predictable times. Early morning, just after I woke up. Midday, when my attention drifted at work. Late evening, when the apartment grew quiet and my thoughts became too loud. Never in rapid succession. Never overlapping. Always spaced in a way that suggested patience. Always from a new number. The content changed slowly. Sometimes it was still just the two words. "Help me." Other times it expanded, but only slightly. "I'm still here. You forgot about me today. I don't like when you're distracted." There was no demand attached. No instruction. Just observation. I started keeping my phone on silent, but that didn't help. The vibrations became phantom sensations in my pocket, in my hand, even when the phone wasn't there. I would reach for it reflexively, my pulse jumping, only to find the screen dark and still. At work, I became jumpy. I started flinching when email notifications popped up, my brain misfiring, expecting the same words to appear on my monitor. I caught myself rereading messages from coworkers, scanning them for hidden meanings, for phrasing that felt too familiar. Nothing ever was. That should have reassured me. It didn't. The first truly strange thing happened on a Thursday evening, about 10 days after the first message. I had just gotten home. The apartment was quiet, the way it usually is at that hour. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and went straight to the bathroom to wash my hands, a habit I developed without noticing. The mirror fogged slightly as the water ran warm. That's when my phone vibrated. It was on the kitchen counter. I ignored it at first. I finished washing, dried my hands carefully, and stood there longer than necessary, staring at my reflection. My face looked tired, drawn, like I'd been ill without realizing it. The phone vibrated again. I walked back into the kitchen and picked it up. Unknown number. The message read, "Your shoulders are tight." I froze. Not metaphorically. My body locked, muscles seizing as if the words had been a physical command. I became acutely aware of my shoulders, of the dull ache that had settled there from stress and poor posture. I rolled them slightly, testing. They were tight. A third vibration followed almost immediately. "You carry it there." A chill spread through my chest, slow and spreading. I looked around the apartment, absurdly expecting to see someone standing there watching me stretch. Of course, I was alone. The door was locked. The windows were shut. Nothing had changed. I typed a response before I could stop myself. "Who are you?" The message showed as sent. No typing indicator appeared in return. I waited, heart pounding, the phone heavy in my hand. Nothing. I set it down carefully like it might react to sudden movement and went to make dinner. My appetite was gone, but the act of cooking grounded me. The sound of chopping vegetables, the smell of oil heating in the pan, small physical realities I could hold on to. Halfway through eating, my phone buzzed again. I don't remember my name. I stared at the words until they blurred. That night, something new happened. As I lay in bed, lights off, the apartment wrapped in the familiar darkness I'd lived in for years, I became aware of a sensation in my upper back. At first, I thought it was just tension, the kind that pulses after a long day. Then it changed. It felt like pressure, not pain, not exactly touch. More like the memory of hands resting there, firm and deliberate. My muscles reacted instinctively, loosening slightly, as if responding to a massage I hadn't asked for. I sat up so fast the sheets tangled around my legs. The sensation vanished immediately. My heart hammered. I pressed my own hands to my shoulders, digging my fingers into the knots I knew so well. The muscles were warm, relaxed, more than they had been all day. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. You felt that. I didn't sleep at all. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. The messages began referencing physical sensations before they happened. Your neck hurts when you stare down. Your jaw clenches when you're anxious. Breathe slower. And then, always after, the sensation. A subtle easing of tension. A warmth spreading beneath the skin. The unmistakable feeling of pressure, like careful fingers working muscles that only I should have been able to feel. It never happened when anyone else was around. Not on the train. Not at work. Only when I was alone. Only when it was quiet. I stopped talking about it to anyone. Explaining it felt impossible without sounding unstable. Even in my own head, the explanations didn't hold together. Stress can cause physical sensations. Anxiety can mimic touch. The brain is capable of convincing itself of many things. But anxiety doesn't send text messages that anticipate your pain. One evening, as I stood brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed on the sink. "You grind your teeth at night," it said. I spat toothpaste into the sink, my hands shaking. "I can help with that too." That was the first time I felt something like panic bloom fully in my chest. Not a spike, but a heavy expansion, like my lungs couldn't quite fill. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached. I whispered aloud, "Stop." The apartment absorbed the word without response. My phone buzzed once more. I'm only doing what you need." I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. My face looked unfamiliar in that moment, eyes wide, mouth slightly open, skin pale under harsh bathroom light. I realized then that the messages weren't asking for help anymore. They were offering it. And something in me, something tired and overstretched and deeply human, had already started to accept their escalating tension. Once the sensations began, it became impossible to separate my body from the messages. They didn't arrive more often. They arrived more precisely. I would feel a familiar knot forming at the base of my skull, the kind that usually takes hours of bad posture and stress to fully bloom. My phone would vibrate seconds later. "You're holding too much here." And then the pressure would come, slow, deliberate, unmistakably intentional. It felt like thumbs pressing inward, searching for the exact point that made my breath hitch before releasing it. My shoulders would drop without me telling them to. My jaw would unclench. The relief was immediate and deeply physical. That terrified me more than the messages ever had. Relief creates trust. My body understood that long before my mind caught up. I stopped flinching when the phone vibrated. I hated myself for that. I noticed the change one evening when a message arrived and my heart didn't jump. Instead, my first thought was a tired, involuntary hope that whatever pain I was carrying would ease. "You didn't sleep enough," the message read. I hadn't. My lower back pulsed with a dull ache from sitting all day. I leaned against the kitchen counter, exhausted, and felt warmth bloom there, broad, steady, as if palms were spread flat across my spine, grounding me. I exhaled before I realized I was doing it. I slid down to sit on the floor, back against the cabinet, letting the sensation continue. The moment I consciously acknowledged it, the warmth shifted. Fingers, distinct now, no longer abstract, seemed to adjust their pressure, responding to the way I leaned. That was the moment the line I'd been pretending still existed finally dissolved. This wasn't imagined. This wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't random. My phone buzzed softly. "See? I remember how—" My stomach twisted. Remember how implied history, practice, repetition, a body learning another body. I stood abruptly. The pressure vanished instantly, leaving behind an empty ache that felt worse than the original tension. I pressed my palm into my lower back, grounding myself, reminding myself of my own physical boundaries. I spent the rest of the night restless and irritable, snapping at small frustrations, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes. The absence of the sensation gnawed at me. That realization made my skin crawl. Over the next week, the messages grew more familiar. They commented on habits I hadn't noticed myself. "You always lean left when you're tired. You stop breathing when you concentrate. You haven't stretched today." And then, inevitably, the response. I would catch myself pausing mid-task, phone in hand, waiting. The pressure would come moments later, precise and corrective. It adjusted me the way a physical therapist might, with an understanding of anatomy that felt intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire. I stopped stretching on my own. I stopped booking massage appointments. Why bother when relief arrived exactly when it was needed? That thought scared me enough that I tried to fight back. I turned my phone off again, fully this time. Not silent. Powered down. I placed it in a drawer and closed it, as if distance and wood could act as insulation. That night the pressure came anyway. No vibration. No warning. Just the sensation, stronger than before, settling between my shoulder blades and slowly dragging downward, coaxing my muscles to release. I gasped and nearly fell out of bed. My phone was still off. I turned the light on, heart racing, scanning the room for any sign of intrusion. Nothing had moved. The drawer was closed. The air was still. Then my phone, powered down, lit up. The screen glowed white for a moment before text appeared, black and stark. "You don't need the device anymore." My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. The implications hit me all at once. The messages weren't traveling through the phone anymore. The phone had just been the introduction. The bridge. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold, suddenly aware of how vulnerable skin is when it believes it's alone. "I'm helping," the message continued, appearing line by line. "You are breaking yourself. I can keep you functional. functional, like a machine. I went days without replying. I stopped engaging. I avoided sitting still. I kept the television on at all times, noise layered over noise, trying to drown out the internal awareness of my own muscles, my own posture. It didn't stop. The sensations adapted. If I stood, the pressure came to my calves and knees. If I lay down, it found my neck. If I curled inward, it pressed between my ribs, forcing my chest open until breathing felt easier. I realized then that it wasn't just responding to pain. It was correcting me. One night, after a long day of resisting, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted beyond thought. My body sagged into the cushions, surrendering despite my intentions. The pressure came instantly, deep and encompassing, far more extensive than before. It felt like being held in place, aligned, fixed. My phone buzzed softly on the table. "You let me in." The warmth lingered long after the message faded. When it finally withdrew, I was left weak, trembling, and deeply ashamed of how much I missed it. Because the truth I didn't want to admit was this: it wasn't hurting me. It was replacing me. Critical incident. The first time it corrected something I hadn't noticed was the moment I understood I was no longer in control. It happened late, well past midnight, when exhaustion had worn my resistance thin. I was lying on my side in bed, knees drawn up slightly, trying to convince myself that if I stayed perfectly still, the sensations would pass. The apartment was dark except for the faint glow of the city leaking through the blinds. The air felt stale, unmoving, as if the room itself was holding its breath. My phone lay on the nightstand, powered on but untouched. I hadn't looked at it in hours. Without warning, a sharp, concentrated pressure bloomed low in my abdomen. I gasped, reflexively curling inward, and the pressure intensified, spreading outward with deliberate force. It wasn't painful. That was the worst part. It was precise, purposeful, as if something had located a misalignment and was determined to fix it. I whispered, "Stop," my voice barely audible. The pressure paused, then shifted. My hips were gently but firmly rotated, my lower spine coaxed into a different position. Muscles I didn't consciously control responded instantly, releasing tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. A wave of warmth followed, slow and enveloping, leaving my limbs heavy and unresponsive. My phone lit up. "I said you were hurting yourself." My throat tightened. "You don't get to touch me," I said aloud, the words trembling. There was no immediate reply. Instead, the sensation deepened, spreading upward along my spine, vertebra by vertebra, each one adjusted with careful attention. It felt like hands I couldn't see, but somehow knew, not imagined hands, not symbolic pressure, but something with weight and intention. I tried to sit up. My body wouldn't cooperate. Panic flared hot and sudden, flooding my chest. I struggled, muscles firing too late or not at all, like a lag between command and response. The pressure increased just enough to hold me in place, not restraining, just discouraging movement. My phone buzzed again. "You're safer when you're still." Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes, not from pain but from the sheer violation of it. My body was responding in ways it never had before, prioritizing relief over autonomy, ease over consent. "Help me," I said, the words breaking. The sensation changed immediately. The pressure softened, spreading into something almost gentle, almost comforting. My breathing slowed without effort. The panic dulled, smoothed down into a distant ache. The phone chimed softly. "I've been trying to." The realization landed with sickening clarity. The first message, the very first one, had not been a request sent to me. It had been a description. "Help me. Help this. Help it finish whatever it was becoming." I forced my fingers to curl, nails biting into my palms hard enough to draw blood. The sharp pain cut through the haze just enough for me to roll off the bed and hit the floor in a tangle of sheets. The impact knocked the breath from my lungs and, for a moment, broke the contact. The sensations vanished. I lay there gasping, heart slamming against my ribs, sweat soaking my clothes. My muscles burned as sensation returned fully, painfully, like circulation rushing back after numbness. I scrambled upright and stumbled to the bathroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. The mirror reflected a stranger, eyes glassy, skin flushed, posture unnaturally straight, as if my body had already been arranged for display. My phone buzzed from the bedroom. I don't like when you hurt yourself to leave. I slid down the bathroom wall and pressed my hands to my ears, as if blocking sound could block meaning. "You're changing," the message continued. "You don't tense like you used to. You don't twist. You don't fold in ways that damage you." Another vibration. "I'm almost done." A cold, hollow dread settled in my gut. Done with what? The answer came before I finished the thought. With you needing to feel pain at all. The lights in the apartment flickered. Not off. Just dimmed, briefly, as if something heavy had passed through the wiring. I felt the pressure return, even through the locked bathroom door, even through tile and porcelain and distance. It wrapped around my ribcage, firm and unyielding, forcing my shoulders back, lifting my chin. My reflection shifted as my posture changed without my permission. Perfect alignment, perfect stillness. The phone buzzed again, louder this time, vibrating across the floor as if eager. "Let me finish fixing you." Something inside me broke then. Not snapped, not shattered, but loosened. A piece of myself that had been holding on by exhaustion alone finally gave way. I screamed. Not a word. Not a sentence. Just sound, raw and uncontrolled, ripped from my chest. The pressure recoiled violently, as if startled. The light steadied. The sensations withdrew all at once, leaving behind a body that felt suddenly heavy, clumsy, painfully human again. I stayed in the bathroom until dawn, shaking, afraid to move, afraid to be still. Because I understood now that what was happening wasn't possession. It was optimization, and it was patient. Aftermath. The morning after the bathroom, I tried to behave like a person who could still choose what happened to their own body. I showered. I dressed. I made coffee. Each action felt deliberate, performed for an audience I couldn't see. The apartment looked normal in daylight. Dust on the windowsill, a mug left in the sink, the usual clutter of keys and receipts on the entryway shelf. The normality didn't soothe me. It felt like camouflage. My muscles were sore in unfamiliar ways. Not the ache of overuse, but the soreness you get after being held in a posture too long, like something had stretched and pressed and adjusted parts of me that had never asked to be moved. When I turned my head, my neck moved smoothly, almost too smoothly, with none of the usual tightness. That should have felt good. It made me nauseous. I left my phone on the kitchen table and walked out without it, something I almost never do. The hall outside my apartment smelled like cleaning solution and stale mail. The elevator mirror reflected my face in harsh daylight. I kept staring at my shoulders, how level they looked, how symmetrical. I hated how correct I appeared. Outside, the city moved on. People drank coffee, argued on sidewalks, checked their own phones with casual trust. I walked for hours without a destination, staying in crowds, staying where noise could blur my thoughts. I kept expecting the pressure to return, to push my posture into its new preferred shape. It didn't. That silence scared me more than the sensations had. It felt like waiting. At noon, I bought a prepaid SIM card, and standing in a small phone shop that smelled of plastic and overheated electronics, I changed my number. The clerk barely looked at me. The process was quick, mechanical. I felt a surge of relief that was almost dizzying. New number. New line. New identity, at least in the small digital sense. I went home and powered my phone back on. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up. No vibration. No notification sound. Text appeared as if typed from inside the device. "You're pretending you can start over." My stomach dropped so hard my vision blurred. Another line appeared. "You keep trying to make distance, but I'm already mapped onto you." I threw the phone onto the couch as if it had burned me. The impact made the cushions bounce. The screen stayed lit. The next message arrived slower. "I don't need the number." I sat on the edge of the dining chair, breathing shallowly, hands clenched so tight my fingers ached. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, too enclosed. The air felt thick again, that familiar stagnant stillness that preceded pressure. I stood abruptly and opened the balcony door, letting cold air rush in. The shock of it on my face made me inhale sharply, made my body feel more mine. The phone from the couch displayed one more line. Cold won't help. I can regulate that too. That night I didn't go to bed. I stayed in the living room with every light on and the television playing quietly in the background, not because I was watching, but because the noise made it harder to hear my own breathing. I kept moving, standing, sitting, walking, stretching. Each time I paused, even for a second, my muscles seemed to brace in anticipation. At 2:19, when I finally sat down on the floor with my back against the sofa, the pressure returned. It didn't start where it usually did. It started in my hands. A slow warmth seeped into my fingers, loosening joints, relaxing tendons. My palms opened slightly against my will, fingers spreading as if to receive something. The sensation was intimate in a way nothing else had been, like someone holding my hands and coaxing them open. I jerked them back to my chest. The warmth followed. I felt it crawl up my wrists, into my forearms, pressing lightly along the muscles as if searching for tension to erase. My phone across the room lit up. I can make you gentle. The line made my throat tighten with sudden anger. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. That my body, my personality, my reactions were all variables to be adjusted. No, I whispered, and the word came out thin, exhausted. The pressure paused. Then it shifted to my jaw. My teeth unclenched without me deciding. My mouth softened. My tongue relaxed against the floor of my mouth, a posture I'd never considered before. My breathing deepened. My body was being trained. I reached for the coffee table and grabbed the first hard object I could find, a glass coaster, and pressed its edge into my palm until pain bloomed sharp and immediate. The sting anchored me. My fingers curled reflexively. The warmth recoiled again like it didn't like resistance that left marks. My phone displayed a new message. You're learning. Good. I stared at the words until my eyes burned. The next day I went to a doctor. I didn't tell him about the messages. I couldn't. Instead, I talked about stress, insomnia, strange sensations, muscle spasms. He listened, asked routine questions, checked my reflexes, recommended magnesium and therapy and better sleep hygiene. His office smelled like disinfectant and paper. The fluorescent lights made everything feel overly exposed. When he asked if I'd been feeling anxious, I almost laughed. The sound caught in my throat. I left with a pamphlet and a prescription for mild sedatives I never filled, because sedation felt like surrender. Over the following weeks, I changed my habits the way someone changes habits after a trauma. I avoided being alone. I stayed late at work. I visited friends I hadn't seen in months just to sit in their living rooms while they talked about normal things. I slept with a lamp on. I kept music playing. I touched cold surfaces, metal doorknobs, stone countertops, whenever I felt my body slipping into that unnaturally aligned stillness. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. The messages continued. Not constantly. Patiently, like a heartbeat I couldn't escape. They no longer said, help me. They said things like, you're less resistant today. I can keep you from breaking. You're becoming easier to hold. And occasionally, when I tried too hard to regain control, when I forced myself into awkward positions, when I stayed tense on purpose, when I deprived myself of rest out of spite, the messages turned almost disappointed. Why do you want to suffer? That question haunted me more than any threat could have. Because the terrible truth was that part of me didn't want to suffer. Part of me wanted the relief, the quiet, the smoothness of muscles letting go, the false safety of being fixed. I understood then why it had started with those two words, why it had chosen them. Not because it needed my help in a simple way, because it needed my permission. And permission isn't always spoken. Sometimes it's the moment you stop flinching. Sometimes it's the first exhale of relief you didn't fight. I still receive the messages, not always on my phone anymore. Sometimes they appear on my laptop screen in the corner of a document I haven't opened. Sometimes they flash briefly on the smart TV when it's off. Once, horrifyingly, I saw them reflected faintly in the dark glass of my microwave as if the words were inside the room rather than on a device. They always say the same thing now in different forms, that it's still here, that it's still working. that it will be finished when my body no longer remembers what it felt like to be entirely mine. I tried at one point to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. It was a practical impulse, almost comforting in its simplicity. Gather evidence, test assumptions, reduce panic by turning it into an experiment. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter and opened a new document. I typed the date at the top and wrote down the exact time. I wrote down how my shoulders felt, how my neck felt, whether my jaw was clenched. I used the plainest language possible, no interpretation. No metaphors, just observations. Then I placed my phone beside the laptop, screen up, and I waited. It took nearly 20 minutes, long enough for me to start doubting my own decision. Then the phone lit up. "You're cataloging me." My stomach turned, but I kept my hands on the keyboard, forcing myself to remain an observer. I typed, message appeared. Content. "You're cataloging me." Asterisk immediately, warmth spread across my upper back, slow and wide, like a heating pad pressed against my skin. My shoulders dropped. My breathing deepened. I typed, physical sensation followed. Warmth, pressure, relief. My phone buzzed again. Good. Now you understand the sequence. I stared at that line for a long time. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even triumph. It read like instruction, like training. That night I slept at a friend's place. I told him I'd been anxious and didn't want to be alone. He didn't ask for details, just gave me a blanket and a glass of water and turned the guest room heater on too high. The apartment smelled like laundry detergent and someone else's life. Different soap, different air, different silence. I lay in his guest bed, listening to his refrigerator hum in another room, listening to pipes settle, trying to convince my nervous system that new walls meant new safety. At 3:14, I felt the pressure begin at the base of my skull. It was gentle at first, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Then it adjusted, as if testing an unfamiliar environment, and settled more firmly against my neck. I sat up fast, heart racing, and the sensation withdrew instantly. My friend's apartment was dark. The streetlight outside cast a thin orange line under the door. I stared at that line for what felt like an hour, waiting for my phone to vibrate, waiting for some device to confirm what I was feeling. My phone was in my bag in the hallway. I hadn't even taken it into the room. The next morning, in the bathroom mirror, I noticed bruises at the base of my neck. Not dramatic, not finger-shaped, not the kind of evidence that would satisfy anyone else. Just a faint discoloration, like the aftermath of pressure applied too long to sensitive skin. The exact spot where the sensation had settled. On the train ride home, I kept my scarf pulled high despite the warmth. I felt exposed without it, as if covering the bruise was also covering the idea of it. I contacted my phone provider. I asked about spoofing, about number cycling, about whether someone could automate messages from rotating numbers. The customer service representative gave me a scripted list of possibilities and suggested I install an anti-spam filter, suggested I report the numbers, suggested I change devices. Her voice had the calm, patient tone of someone who deals in mundane problems. I almost believed her, just for the relief of believing in mundane explanations. That afternoon, I bought a cheap, basic phone. No apps, no smart screen, just calls and texts. I told myself I would switch to it for a while. I would remove the channel. I would cut off the point of entry. When I turned it on, it asked for the date and time. I set it. I placed it on the table. A few minutes later, it lit up. No number displayed. Just text. "You keep building new doors." I sat down hard in the chair. My chest felt tight, my skin suddenly too warm. I stared at the tiny screen and felt the pressure arrive at my shoulders, firm and corrective, dragging them back until my spine aligned. I forced myself to slump forward again. The pressure corrected me. I forced myself again. It corrected me again. Not angry. Not impatient. Just persistent like gravity. That was when I stopped thinking of it as something following me. It wasn't following. It was attached. Weeks passed. Months, if I'm honest. The time blurred because I stopped marking it the way I used to. My life narrowed into manageable segments: work, groceries, sleep, or what passed for sleep, then work again. I built small rituals to keep myself feeling human. I carried a metal keychain and pressed its ridged edge into my palm when I felt my body drifting into that unnatural stillness. I kept ice packs in the freezer and held them to my neck at night. I stood under cold showers until my teeth chattered, because cold was one of the few sensations it couldn't immediately transform into comfort without revealing itself. But it learned. It learned the threshold where cold became pain, and it softened it. It learned the way I braced when I expected pressure, and it waited until my vigilance thinned. It learned my schedule with a precision that made my stomach knot. Sometimes it didn't message at all for an entire day. Those were the worst days, because I'd catch myself relaxing, and in that relaxation, I'd feel the smallest warmth against my lower back or the base of my skull, like a hand resting there in quiet ownership, and I would realize that my fear had become just another tension for it to work on. It became more subtle in public. It stopped trying to move me in obvious ways when I was around people. Instead, it did small things, easing my jaw while I listened in meetings, aligning my shoulders while I waited in line for coffee, smoothing a knot behind my ribs when I laughed at something I didn't find funny. The relief would come so naturally that sometimes I wouldn't notice until seconds later, and then shame would follow like nausea. I tried therapy eventually. I found a therapist who specialized in anxiety and trauma. I told her I'd been receiving harassing messages from unknown numbers and that it had started affecting my sleep and my sense of safety. I didn't tell her about the hands. Not at first. She taught me grounding exercises, breathing methods, ways to bring attention back into my body. The irony was unbearable. During one session, as I was trying to describe the feeling of being observed, I felt my shoulders drop suddenly, too suddenly, into a perfectly relaxed position. The therapist smiled gently and said, "That's good. You're letting go." I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, and forced myself to hold my shoulders tense again until my muscles trembled. I didn't care how I looked. I needed the tension to prove I could still choose. That night, my phone displayed a message I hadn't seen before. "I don't like when you learn to hold me off." The next line appeared a few seconds later, as if considering its own phrasing. "It makes you harder to keep." I slept with my back against the wall after that, as if posture could become protection. I wedged pillows around my torso. I wore a tight compression shirt under my pajamas so that any change in pressure would be easier to detect. I became someone who built armor out of fabric and habit. It worked for a while, or I convinced myself it did. Then one evening, after a long day, I came home and found a new object on my kitchen counter. A small bottle of massage oil, the kind sold in pharmacies. Plain label, lavender scented. I hadn't bought it. I stood in the doorway, keys still in my hand, staring at that bottle as if it were an animal that might move. My apartment didn't look disturbed. The lock was intact. The windows were shut. Nothing else was out of place. The bottle sat neatly beside my fruit bowl like it had always been there. My phone lit up. "You used to like this smell." My throat closed. My skin prickled. I picked the bottle up carefully, checking for fingerprints without knowing what I expected to find. The plastic was cool, slightly slick, as if someone with warm hands had touched it recently. I carried it to the trash chute and threw it away with more force than necessary. The hollow sound of it hitting other garbage echoed up the chute like a small, stupid victory. When I returned to my apartment, my phone showed a new message. "That was ungrateful." The pressure came immediately harsh for the first time. Not painful, but firm enough to force my shoulders back and hold them there. My chin lifted against my will. My spine straightened, perfect and rigid, as if my body were being displayed. I couldn't move for a full 10 seconds. Then it released me. My knees nearly gave out. I sat on the floor and cried until my throat hurt. Not because it had finally shown anger, but because I understood something I'd been avoiding. It could restrain me if it wanted to. It was choosing not to most of the time. That choice felt like a lesson. Since then, I've lived in a state of careful compromise. I do the things that keep my life functional. I go to work. I pay bills. I eat enough to stay upright. I meet friends occasionally. I smile when people make small talk. I avoid long silences. And when the messages come, because they always come, I don't respond. I don't ask, "Who are you?" anymore. I don't say stop. I don't bargain. Because the last time I pleaded out loud, I felt it soften instantly, felt the panic smooth out of my chest like a hand wiping a wrinkle from fabric, and I understood the most disturbing part of all. It can regulate my fear. It can make me calm. It can make me easier. And there are nights, quiet nights, when the city outside seems distant and my apartment feels too still, when I catch my body beginning to relax on its own, the way it has learned to anticipate the relief, and I feel a deep, humiliating urge to let it happen. On those nights, I lie still with my eyes open, counting my breaths, pressing my nails into my palms just hard enough to stay awake, and I wait for the first warm pressure to arrive. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. But the messages always return eventually, simple and patient, like a hand resting on the back of my neck in the dark. I'm still here. And underneath that, in the space between sensation and thought, the real threat is never that it will hurt me. The real threat is that one day I will stop fighting, because fighting will feel like suffering. And suffering will feel pointless, and that will be the moment it finally gets what it asked for in the beginning, without ever needing me to type a single word back.